This is a story about a brilliant young man who had millions of dollars in the bank, but was so completely consumed by a single terrifying thought that he ended up building a literal maze of death right beneath his own home. And because of his actions, a young 19-year-old man who trusted him with his life would find himself trapped in a pitch-black nightmare with absolutely no way out. To understand how this tragedy happened, we have to go back to the beginning of the story of Daniel Beckwith. Daniel was born in 1,991 inches, Bethesda, Maryland, which is a very quiet and wealthy suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. Daniel was the only child of two highly eccentric and incredibly intelligent parents named Linda and David. His father, David, had a doctoral degree and was a very accomplished opera singer who had actually performed at the White House. His mother, Linda, was a brilliant lawyer who had graduated from the prestigious Columbia Law School and had worked as a high-level government attorney. But Linda eventually decided that the legal profession was far too corrupt for her liking, so she gave it all up to become an opera singer just like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, his parents realized that he was not like other children. He taught himself how to read before he was even 3 years old. He had an incredibly high intellect, and his mother became fiercely protective of him. She decided that the public school system was simply not advanced enough to teach her brilliant son, so she chose to homeschool him. By the time Daniel was 5 years old, he was reading thick classic novels, and shortly after that, he figured out how to completely dismantle and reprogram his video game systems. But despite his massive intelligence, Daniel had a very lonely and isolated childhood. He was almost never allowed to go outside and play with the other children in the neighborhood. On the rare occasions that he was permitted to step outside, his parents would hover over him the entire time, watching his every move. And almost nobody from the neighborhood was ever allowed to come inside the Beckwith house. This was because Daniel's parents were severe hoarders. If you stepped through the front door of that house, you would immediately run into towering stacks of old papers, books, rotting cardboard boxes, and discarded food containers. Then, in the year 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This meant his mother had to take care of both her ailing husband and her young son, and under the immense stress, her eccentric behavior grew much worse. She became completely obsessed with protecting their property. If a neighbor walked even slightly too close to her lawn, Linda would run out of the front door and scream at them until they ran away. But despite how strange they were, anyone who knew the Beckwith family could tell that Linda and David absolutely adored their son. They just could not give him any personal space. One neighbor recalled seeing the family out trick-or-treating for Halloween, and even though Daniel was a teenager by then, all three of them were wearing matching giant hamster outfits. Daniel loved his parents, but as he grew older, he realized how smothering they really were. He wanted to connect with people his own age, so he turned to the internet. He found a community on an anonymous online forum called 4chan. On this forum, Daniel could pretend to be whoever he wanted. He created a tough guy persona, bragging to other users about how he had finished high school by age 15 and spent his free time building explosives in his backyard. But occasionally, Daniel would let his guard down and talk about a deep, paralyzing fear that occupied his thoughts at all times. This was his extreme fear of death. In 2010, it looked like Daniel's isolation might finally end. He enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the train station, and as the train pulled away, Daniel felt a massive wave of relief. He felt like he was finally free. But just a few months into his first semester, he received terrible news. His mother had been diagnosed with cancer. She had hidden her illness from everyone, including Daniel, and had refused to see a doctor. By the time Daniel rushed back home, she was in terrible shape, and she passed away just 2 weeks later. Only 3 people showed up to her funeral. Daniel stood there in mismatched clothes and pants that were far too short, looking completely dazed as he gave her eulogy, telling the small crowd that he felt totally lost. After he went back to college, his father's health began to decline rapidly, and Daniel had to place him into an assisted living facility. Living alone in his college apartment, Daniel was completely consumed by grief and a massive escalation of his fear of death. He had seen his mother die suddenly, and now he was watching his father slowly wither away. He went back onto the online forums and talked about taking a defensive position against his own mortality. To do this, Daniel researched the most common causes of death for young men his age. When he saw that car accidents were a leading cause, he went out and reinforced all the doors of his car with heavy Kevlar plates, and whenever he drove the car, he wore a thick, bulletproof Kevlar vest because he believed it would protect his internal organs from blunt force trauma in a crash. He also knew that cancer was a major killer, so he personally went to a doctor and demanded that every single mole on his body be surgically removed as a preventative measure. But the thing that Daniel feared most was not a car accident or a disease. He became absolutely convinced that a nuclear attack on the United States was imminent. He believed the only way to survive was to build a proper underground fallout shelter. Fortunately for him, his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, so he had the money to do whatever he wanted. He put his college studies on hold, returned to his childhood home in Bethesda, went down into the basement, and began to dig a massive hole right in the center of the concrete floor. Over the next 2 years, Daniel split his time between his college classes and his secret project in Bethesda. He hired various contractors to come to his home and dig a massive, sprawling labyrinth of tunnels deep beneath his property. But in 2012, both his schoolwork and his tunnel digging came to a sudden halt because of his own bizarre behavior. Professors at his university began to report that someone was sneaking into their offices at night, hacking into their computers, and sending highly inappropriate and embarrassing emails to their entire contact lists of students and faculty. After sending the emails, the hacker would use superglue to seal the professor's office doors shut so they could not get inside the next morning. The university police department investigated the strange vandalism for months. Eventually, several students pointed them toward Daniel, noting that he was a genius-level hacker who had recently spoken at a major cybersecurity conference. A detective went to Daniel's apartment to talk to him, but Daniel did not answer the door. As the detective was standing in the hallway, he noticed a package sitting on the welcome mat. It was addressed to a person named S. Loomis Detwiler. The detective suspected this might be an alias for Daniel, so he went back to the station and ran the name through their databases. It turned out that this alias was connected to an online profile that had recently been bragging about breaking into university offices and hacking the professors. With this information, the police secured a search warrant for Daniel's apartment. When officers entered the apartment using a spare key, they were met with a scene of absolute chaos. The apartment was packed with towering piles of papers, books, computer wires, trash, and old food boxes. A dirty mattress with no sheets sat right in the middle of the room. On top of a mini fridge in the corner, detectives found Daniel's laptop. It was open and unlocked. The officers cloned his hard drive right then and there, and the digital evidence they recovered proved beyond a doubt that Daniel was indeed the hacker. Daniel was arrested and charged with multiple serious felonies, but right before his trial, his lawyers managed to secure a plea deal. Daniel immediately went onto the website Reddit and bragged to online users that he fully expected the state governor to step in and pardon him because he had donated a large sum of money to the governor's campaign, but that pardon never came. Fortunately for Daniel, the judge gave him a very light sentence. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the university and was placed on 2 years of probation. But Daniel was expelled from the university, so he moved back into his childhood home in Bethesda to live alone. With no school to worry about, he poured all of his energy into building his underground bunker. He hired specialized contractors to expand the tunnels, digging deep into the earth and branching out in multiple directions, eventually crossing well past his own property lines. To fund his ongoing project, Daniel turned his attention to trading Bitcoin. Because of his mathematical brilliance, he became incredibly good at day trading cryptocurrency. Within a short period of time, he made millions of dollars. By 2015, his probation had ended and his massive underground bunker was mostly complete. He spent less time trading and more time sitting inside his bunker, live streaming on a popular website called Blab. During these live streams, Daniel talked at length about his investment strategies and how he had accumulated his fortune. But he was deeply paranoid about anyone discovering his real identity or his location. Whenever he went live, he wore a large, heavy fire protection hood that completely covered his head and face, and he used a voice changer to mask his voice. He went by the online username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. Among his small but very loyal group of followers was a 19-year-old young man named Askia Kafra. Askia lived in a pleasant, middle-class neighborhood only 15 minutes away from Daniel's house, but he had no idea they were neighbors. Daniel always claimed that he lived in a secret underground bunker somewhere deep in the state of Virginia. Askia completely idolized this mysterious online millionaire. Askia was the son of hardworking immigrants from Trinidad, and he desperately wanted to be successful and wealthy. When Askia turned 18, he had received a $100,000 financial settlement from a childhood lead poisoning lawsuit. For a brief moment, he got a taste of what it was like to be rich. But he was young and naive, and he quickly blew through all of the money on expensive dinners, designer clothes, and renting high-end sports cars like Mercedes and BMWs. Once the money was completely gone, Askia was determined to get it all back. He came up with a business plan to build a new smartphone app called Equity Shark. The app was designed to be a crowdfunding platform that would allow average people to invest small amounts of money into promising new startup companies. Askia was convinced that this app was going to make him a billionaire. But he had no money left to actually build the app. He and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs who had dropped out of college, which Askia had recently done. Askia was highly confident they would get the grant, but he still had many of the blind spots of a young man learning how to navigate the adult world. His biggest weakness was that he was incredibly trusting, and he was quick to believe anyone who seemed successful. It was during this time that Askia found Daniel's live streams on Blab. He was amazed by this wealthy figure who called himself 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. When Daniel mentioned to his viewers that he was looking to make some new business investments, Askia saw his chance. He reached out to Daniel and asked if he and his partner could pitch their app, Equity Shark, to him. Daniel agreed. In June of 2016, Askia and his partner went to a local hookah bar to meet this mysterious investor. They had no idea what he actually looked like because he always wore the fire protection hood online. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door of the bar, they knew it was him. Daniel was wearing an incredibly bulky, oversized shirt, and it was obvious to everyone in the room that he was wearing a heavy bulletproof vest underneath it. Askia and his partner simply overlooked this strange behavior, assuming it was just another one of the eccentricities of a tech genius. They sat down and pitched Equity Shark to Daniel. They explained that their success rested on securing the $100,000 grant, which they were absolutely certain they would receive. Daniel was highly impressed by their pitch, and he agreed to invest $5,000 of his own money into their company. But he made them sign an agreement stating that they had to pay him back using the grant money, and if they did not get the grant, they would have to find another way to repay him. Askia was thrilled. He felt that getting the grant was a sure thing, so there was absolutely no risk in taking Daniel's money. Shortly after securing the $5,000, the program manager for the grant called Askia and told him that his company had made it to the second round. They needed to fly out to San Francisco to pitch their idea in person. Askia and his partner were incredibly excited. They immediately called Daniel to tell him the good news, and then they booked their flights. But in their excitement and lack of travel experience, they made a massive mistake. They booked their flights to Los Angeles International Airport instead of San Francisco, which put them 400 miles south of where they needed to be. When they landed in Los Angeles and realized what they had done, they panicked. They tried to rent a car to drive north, but because they were under 25, no rental car company would give them a vehicle. In desperation, they realized they were old enough to rent a U-Haul moving truck. They rented a massive U-Haul and began speeding up the California highway, trying to make it to San Francisco in time for their meeting. But they made another critical error. They entered the wrong address into their GPS, which sent them miles in the wrong direction. By the time they finally arrived at the meeting location in San Francisco, they were hours late. The grant manager was extremely upset and told them to just go back home and wait for a phone call. Back in Maryland, Askia was deeply embarrassed. He confessed to Daniel that they had completely ruined the trip and that they likely would not receive the grant. Askia asked Daniel if he would be willing to invest even more money to help them salvage the app, but Daniel was clearly losing interest in Equity Shark and was hesitant to put any more of his fortune into it. Hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and prove his worth, Askia offered to do some physical labor for him. He had heard Daniel mention on his live streams that he was looking to expand some of the underground tunnels in his bunker, and Askia offered to do the digging. Daniel was eager to hire him, but he told Askia that because the bunker was a highly classified and secret location, there would be very strict security rules. Daniel explained that he could not allow anyone to know the address of his home because of the imminent threat of a nuclear strike. Askia agreed to all of the rules. On the 28th of January 2017, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, Askia stood outside his house waiting to be picked up. Daniel arrived in a minivan, got out, and handed Askia a pair of heavily modified safety goggles that had been painted completely black so that Askia could not see anything. Daniel then put the goggles on Askia's head, guided him into the passenger seat, and began to drive. Daniel drove in continuous looping circles on the highway and back and forth through various neighborhoods. He wanted to make Askia believe they were traveling to a remote location far away in Virginia, when in reality, they were just driving in circles before heading back to Daniel's house only 15 minutes away. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel kept the blackout goggles on Askia's face. He tied a string to Askia's wrist and led him like a blind dog out of the van and toward the house. Inside, Daniel carefully guided him through the narrow, cluttered pathways between the massive piles of hoarded trash and papers. They walked all the way to the back of the house, went down the stairs, and entered the basement. In the basement, Daniel had constructed a highly complex maze using chicken wire, stacks of old bicycles, books, and heaps of junk. This maze was specifically designed so that even if a worker came up out of the tunnels, they would be completely disoriented and would not be able to find their way out of the basement without help. Daniel led Askia through this bizarre, dark maze until they reached a gaping hole in the concrete floor. This was the entrance to the underground tunnel system. Only then did Daniel allow Askia to remove his blackout goggles. When Askia looked down into the hole, he was absolutely stunned. He saw a massive, clean, and well-lit network of tunnels stretching out in multiple directions beneath the house. He looked at Daniel in disbelief, asking how far the tunnels actually went, and Daniel proudly told him that the system was enormous. Daniel handed Askia a heavy pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. Then he explained the working conditions. He told Askia that whenever he was down in the tunnels, Daniel would have to place a heavy cover over the entrance hole for security reasons. He also told Askia that because the transport process with the blindfold was so difficult, it would be much easier if Askia simply lived down in the tunnels for several days at a time. Daniel assured him that he would be perfectly comfortable. There was a mattress to sleep on, a strong Wi-Fi connection, plenty of lighting, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket to use as a toilet. Askia was uncomfortable with the idea of living in a hole in the dirt, but he trusted Daniel completely, and he was excited to be working for a millionaire whom he respected so much. So, he agreed. Over the next few months, Askia made the bizarre, blindfolded journey to Daniel's house on a regular basis. He spent days at a time underground, breathing in heavy dirt and dust as he used a pickaxe to carve new paths through the earth. But toward the end of the spring, Askia received the devastating news he had been dreading. Equity Shark had been officially rejected for the $100,000 grant. Askia was completely crushed. He also knew that he now had no way to pay back the $5,000 he owed to Daniel. He asked Daniel if he could increase his hours digging in the tunnels to slowly work off his debt. Daniel agreed. On the 10th of September 2017, Askia was back down in the tunnels. He was working in one of the deepest and lowest sections of the bunker. To reach this area, he had to squeeze his body through a very narrow and tight space. Askia had actually sent a text message to his friends earlier that day, telling them that the tunnel was making him feel incredibly claustrophobic, but he knew he had to keep going to pay off his debt. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Askia was deep in the narrow tunnel, the power suddenly went completely out. Everything fell into a pitch-black silence. Upstairs in the main house, Daniel noticed the power outage. He walked down the stairs into the basement, navigated through his chicken wire maze, and located the main electrical circuit breaker. He flipped the heavy switch, and the power instantly surged back on. But as the power returned, Daniel heard a loud, high-pitched buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. He became extremely worried that the sound was being caused by an electrical short circuit that could spark a fire. Instead of checking on Askia first, Daniel immediately reached out and flipped the main circuit breaker back off, plunging Askia back into absolute pitch-black darkness deep underground. Daniel then made his way back through the basement maze, walked up the stairs, and entered the kitchen to find the source of the buzzing sound. But as soon as he stepped into the hallway, he smelled a strong scent of smoke. He turned around and looked back down the basement stairs, and he saw thick, black smoke rapidly billowing up from the basement. Daniel ran back down the stairs and screamed out for Askia. From somewhere deep inside the pitch-black tunnels, he heard Askia's muffled voice yell back, asking what was going on. Daniel screamed for him to get out of there immediately, but the heat and the thick smoke were quickly becoming unbearable. Daniel was forced to run back up the stairs and exit the house to catch his breath in the fresh air. A few moments later, Daniel tried to go back inside. He ran down to the basement stairs, but when he reached the bottom, he did not see Askia. Instead, he saw giant orange flames leaping out of the tunnel entrance. He screamed Askia's name over and over, but there was no response. The heat was too intense, and Daniel had to flee the house. A neighbor saw Daniel standing outside in his yard, screaming hysterically as thick black smoke poured out of the windows of the home. The neighbor immediately called 911. While Daniel was pacing outside, Askia was trapped in a living nightmare. He was deep underground in total darkness. The tunnels were rapidly filling with thick, toxic smoke from the electrical fire. Askia began to crawl desperately through the narrow dirt tunnel, trying to find his way back to the main entrance. Because it was completely dark and his eyes were burning from the smoke, he kept hitting dead ends. But through sheer survival instinct, Askia miraculously managed to find his way back to the main entrance hole. He scrambled out of the hole, gasping for air, only to find himself in a basement that was completely engulfed in flames and thick smoke. This was the moment where Daniel's paranoid security measures became a death sentence. Every single time Askia had been in this basement, he had been wearing blackout goggles. He had absolutely no idea what the layout of the basement looked like. He did not know where the stairs were, and he could not see anything through the dense smoke. He was trapped inside a maze of chicken wire, towering piles of junk, and old bicycles. Desperate to escape the heat, Askia began to scramble over the chicken wire and push past the burning piles of trash. He managed to squeeze past a burning furnace, searching for any sign of an exit. In the distance, through the smoke, he saw a faint glimmer of light. It was a small basement window. Askia rushed toward the window, but as he got closer, his heart sank. Daniel had installed heavy metal security bars over the outside of the window. There was no way to squeeze through them. But Askia refused to give up. In his desperation, he grabbed an old rolling office chair from the clutter, pushed it in front of the window, and climbed on top of it. He used his bare hands to smash the glass pane, hoping he could somehow bypass the bars or scream for help. But the metal bars were set deep into the concrete foundation. They would not budge. After several agonizing minutes of fighting for his life, the toxic smoke overcame him. Askia lost consciousness, fell backward off the chair, and was consumed by the fire. When the fire department finally managed to extinguish the massive blaze, they searched the charred ruins of the basement. They found Askia's body lying directly beneath the small broken window. When investigators first questioned Daniel about why a 19-year-old boy was working in his basement, Daniel tried to downplay the situation. He lied and told the police that the basement was just a cool bachelor pad and that Askia must have simply been asleep down there when the fire started. But as fire investigators began to clear away the debris to find the cause of the fire, they discovered the entrance to the massive underground tunnel system. They were absolutely stunned by the scale of the excavation. As they mapped out the tunnels and examined the basement, they realized the horrific truth of what had happened to Askia. They realized that Daniel had essentially placed Askia into a physical death trap. When the power went out, Askia was trapped deep underground with no light and no way to know that a fire had started. By the time he managed to crawl out of the hole, the basement was already a burning inferno, and because of the chicken wire maze and the piles of hoarded junk, Askia was completely disoriented. The most tragic detail of the investigation was that when Askia was standing on that chair trying to break through the barred window, he was only 2 steps away from a door that led directly to safety. If he had only known which way to turn, he would have lived. But because he had always been blindfolded, he had no idea the door was there. The investigation also revealed that the entire house was a massive fire hazard. Daniel had run dozens of cheap extension cords and heavy-duty power strips from the main house down into the tunnels to power the lights and the Wi-Fi. The electrical system of the old house was simply not built to handle that kind of power load, which is what ultimately triggered the catastrophic electrical fire. Following an intense 8-month investigation, the state prosecutors decided to take action. They charged Daniel Beckwith with involuntary manslaughter, but they also charged him with a much more serious and rare charge in the American legal system. He was charged with second-degree depraved heart murder. This specific charge is used when a person's actions show an utter and complete disregard for the value of human life, to the point where their negligence is so extreme that it is legally treated as an intentional killing. The prosecution argued that by blindfolding Askia, forcing him to work in a dark hole with a blocked exit, and creating a physical maze in a hoarded house, Daniel had created a situation where death was almost inevitable if anything went wrong. They also pointed out that when the power went out, Daniel chose to protect his house from a potential fire by shutting off the breaker, knowingly leaving Askia trapped in the dark while the house burned. During the emotional trial, Askia's parents sat in the courtroom, weeping as they listened to the details of their son's final moments. They described Askia as a loving, ambitious boy who had his whole life ahead of him, but whose trusting nature had been exploited by a paranoid and wealthy man who cared more about his secret bunker than the safety of his workers. Daniel's defense team argued that the fire was a tragic accident and that Daniel had tried to save Askia by running back into the house. But the jury did not agree. They found Daniel guilty of both involuntary manslaughter and second-degree depraved heart murder. He was sentenced to 9 years in state prison. This case left a lasting impact on the quiet community of Bethesda. The massive tunnel system that Daniel spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to dig was eventually filled in with concrete by the city to prevent the surrounding homes from collapsing. Today, the property stands empty, a quiet and eerie reminder of a young man's brilliant mind that was completely destroyed by paranoia, and a tragic young victim who simply wanted to build a better life for himself, but ended up trapped in a nightmare. A young man trusted the wrong person, walked into a hidden underground world, and never made it back out. It's one of the strangest and most tragic cases in recent memory. If you want another true story that's just as unbelievable, click the next video on your screen right now. Just after midnight on the 22nd of June 1991, a man named Charles Holden was heading home. He had just finished a long shift at work and was feeling that deep, bone-tired exhaustion that only comes after a full day's labor. His house was in a quiet part of Harrington, Delaware, a small town where not much usually happened. Before he pulled into his own driveway, he decided to make one last stop. There was a fast food restaurant nearby, one of those places with bright lights that cut through the late-night darkness, and the thought of a quick bite to eat was too good to pass up. He pulled his truck into the nearly empty parking lot, went inside, ordered his food, and was back in his truck in just a few minutes. He started the engine, the familiar rumble, a comforting sound in the quiet night. He was just about to put the truck in drive, a request and head the final few blocks home, when he saw something in his peripheral vision. A figure, a man, was running towards his truck. The man was waving his arms frantically, trying to get Charles's attention, trying to flag him down. Charles hesitated. It was late, after midnight, and this was a complete stranger. Every instinct told him to just drive away. But the man looked desperate. So, against his better judgment, Charles shifted the truck back into park. He rolled down his window just enough to hear what the guy wanted, the cool night air rushing in. The man ran right up to the driver's side window, breathing heavily. He leaned down and explained his situation. He said his sister was in labor right now, having a baby, and he desperately needed a ride to the hospital. The hospital was about a 20-minute drive away, and he had no other way to get there. Charles looked at the man. He tried to read his face to see if he was telling the truth, but it was hard to tell. There was an edge to the man, something that made Charles feel uneasy. His gut was screaming at him that this was a bad idea. And so Charles made what he thought was the sensible decision. He told the man no. He said, "I'm sorry, it's just too late, I have to get home. It's too far out of my way." The stranger's face fell. The desperation was replaced by a look of pure dejection. He didn't argue or plead. He just turned around and started walking away, his shoulders slumped. Charles watched him go. He watched him walk back towards the empty, brightly lit restaurant, a lonely figure in the dark parking lot. And as he watched, a wave of guilt washed over him. What if the guy was telling the truth? What if his sister really was having a baby, and he was the only person who could help? Charles couldn't live with that thought. So, he leaned his head out the window and called out. He said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride. I can't take you all the way, but I'll take you part of the way there." The stranger's face lit up with a huge smile. He ran back to the truck, opened the passenger door without even waiting for Charles to unlock it, and hopped inside. And with that, they took off into the night. The first few minutes of the drive were tense and quiet. Charles focused on the road, acutely aware of the unknown man sitting next to him. The stranger didn't say much, just gave directions. Charles drove for about 3 miles, following the route the man had indicated, heading in the general direction of the hospital. Finally, Charles found a well-lit spot on the side of the road and started to pull over. He turned to the stranger and said, "This is as far as I can take you. My house is only about a block away from here, and I really don't want to get too far from home this late at night." He expected the man to be grateful for the ride, to thank him and get out. But that's not what happened. The moment the truck stopped, the stranger's entire demeanor changed. The smile vanished. His eyes grew cold and angry. He started fumbling inside his jacket pocket, his movements jerky and aggressive. He was clearly reaching for something, and Charles's mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. He thought the man was going for a knife, or maybe even a gun. Before Charles could even process what was happening, the man started screaming at him. He yelled, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I am going to kill you." The threat hung in the small cab of the truck, heavy and terrifying. All the bad feelings Charles had in the parking lot came rushing back, 10 times stronger. He knew he was in serious trouble. But instead of freezing, his adrenaline kicked into high gear. He reacted on pure instinct. In one swift motion, he turned off the truck's engine, ripped the keys right out of the ignition, and threw his door open. He leaped out of the truck and just started running. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. He glanced up and saw the distant glow of a convenience store sign way down the road. That became his target. He figured if he could just make it there, he could find help, he could call the police. He sprinted down the dark road, his heart pounding in his chest. After a few seconds, he risked a look back over his shoulder, and his blood ran cold. The stranger had also jumped out of the truck and was now running after him. And in his hand, glinting under the sparse streetlights, was a screwdriver. The man was holding it like a dagger. And he was fast. Really fast. Charles was running as hard as he could, but the stranger was gaining on him. The footsteps behind him were getting louder and closer. The convenience store still seemed impossibly far away. And in that moment, Charles realized he wasn't going to make it. There was no way he could outrun this guy. So he made a split-second, life-or-death decision. He just stopped. He stopped running, turned around, and put his hands up in the air as a sign of surrender. He yelled out, "Okay, okay, okay, I'll give you a ride. You can go wherever you want to go. Then you can have my keys, you can have my wallet, you can have anything you want. Just please, don't hurt me." The stranger was running full tilt, and he skidded to a stop just a few feet in front of Charles. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He was clearly very pleased with this outcome. He had won. He took a step forward and jabbed the screwdriver towards Charles's chest, not hard enough to break the skin, but enough to make a point. He then gestured with the screwdriver back towards the truck. The message was clear. They were going back. So Charles turned and started the long, terrifying walk back to his own vehicle. The stranger stayed right behind him the whole way, so close Charles could feel his breath. Every few steps, the man would poke him in the back with the tip of the screwdriver, a constant, sharp reminder of who was in control. They finally reached the truck. The stranger ordered Charles to get in the driver's seat and wait. Charles did as he was told. He slid behind the wheel, his hands shaking. The stranger walked around to the passenger side, his hand on the door handle, ready to get in and continue his terrifying plan. But as soon as Charles's body hit the seat, another surge of adrenaline hit him. He still had the keys clutched in his hand. He saw a tiny window of opportunity. Without a second thought, he jammed the key into the ignition, fired up the truck's engine, and slammed his foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward and sped off just as the stranger was pulling the passenger door open. Charles was flying down the road away from the man who had just tried to kill him. He glanced in his rearview mirror. He could see the stranger standing in the middle of the road, absolutely furious. The man started chasing the truck on foot, holding the screwdriver high above his head like he was going to throw it. But after a few seconds, he just stopped, turned around, and walked off into the darkness. Charles was safe. He had escaped. He drove for a few minutes, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. He was completely overwhelmed with relief. His first thought was to call the police, to report the attempted carjacking and assault. But then he thought about it more. It was his own decision to let a complete stranger into his truck in the middle of the night. He felt foolish.
He felt like he had brought this on himself. And so, he decided not to call the police. He just wanted to go home and forget the whole thing ever happened. But then another, more practical fear started to creep in. The spot where he had ditched the stranger, where he had that terrifying confrontation, it wasn't far from his house at all. He was worried. What if this guy was still in the area? What if he saw Charles's truck turn onto his street? He could recognize it, follow him home, and then who knows what could happen. The man was clearly violent and unpredictable. So, Charles made a new plan. He decided he would just stay out of town for a while. He would drive around on the outskirts, give the stranger plenty of time to get far, far away from his neighborhood. He drove aimlessly for about an hour, the minutes ticking by slowly. He went down empty country roads, through quiet residential streets on the other side of town, anywhere but home. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he decided it was safe. Surely, the man was long gone by now. So he turned his truck around and headed back towards his own street in Harrington. He drove slowly, cautiously, scanning the sidewalks. He turned onto his street, the familiar sight of his neighbors' houses, a welcome relief. And then he saw him. Standing right there, walking down the sidewalk just a few houses down from his own, was the stranger. The same man who had just tried to kill him with a screwdriver was now impossibly on his street. Luckily, the man didn't seem to hear or see Charles's truck pull onto the road. His back was turned. Charles's heart leaped into his throat. He didn't even think. He immediately slammed the truck into reverse and backed out of the street as quickly and quietly as he could. He drove off, his mind reeling. This couldn't be a coincidence. What was this guy doing here? Did he know who Charles was? Was he targeting him? Was he waiting for him to come home? All the fear and paranoia came crashing back. At this point, Charles knew he had no choice. He had to call the police. This was no longer just about a random, botched robbery. This felt personal. This felt dangerous. He found a payphone a few miles away and dialed 911. He told the dispatcher the whole incredible story. He explained the initial encounter, the chase, the escape, and now the shocking discovery of the man lurking around his own property. The dispatcher listened patiently and told him they would send an officer to meet him right away. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up to the payphone. Charles explained everything all over again to the officer. He told him how terrified he was that this man might be waiting for him at his house. The officer listened and then told Charles not to worry. He said he would escort Charles back to his property. And if the stranger was still anywhere in the area, they would find him and they would arrest him. So the two of them, the police car following Charles's truck, made their way back to Charles's house. They pulled onto the street. The stranger was gone. They searched the entire area, the front yard, the backyard, the surrounding streets. There was no sign of him. Charles then went into his house, with the officer right behind him. They checked every room. There was no sign of a break-in, nothing was out of place. It seemed like the danger had passed. Charles felt a profound sense of relief. He thanked the officer profusely for his help. He felt like he could finally breathe again. The officer was about to leave, to get back in his patrol car and head back out on his shift. But, just as he was walking out the door, Charles had one last thought. It was almost an afterthought, a final piece of due diligence. He asked the officer if he wouldn't mind doing one more quick sweep. He explained that his mother lived right behind him. Her property was just on the other side of a thick row of bushes that separated their backyards. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived all by herself. Charles just wanted to be absolutely sure that nothing had happened to her, that the stranger hadn't bothered her. It was just a son's instinct, a simple request to make sure his elderly mother was safe. The officer said, of course, no problem at all. He would be happy to go check on her. So, the officer left Charles's house. He walked across Charles's backyard, a perfectly normal patch of grass. He pushed his way through the dense bushes that acted as a natural fence. And he stepped into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he could see that something was terribly wrong. The back window on Dorothy's back door had been completely smashed. Shards of glass littered the small porch, and the door itself was standing slightly ajar, open just a crack, letting the dark night into the house. The officer's training took over instantly. This was no longer a simple welfare check. This was a potential crime scene. He quietly unholstered his pistol, holding it at the ready. He cautiously approached the open door. He pushed it open further and peered inside. He called out Dorothy's name, his voice echoing in the silent house. There was no answer. The house was totally dark, totally still. The officer entered the house, moving slowly and methodically. He cleared the first floor, room by room. He found nothing. No sign of Dorothy, no sign of an intruder. The silence was unnerving. He then made his way to the flight of stairs that led to the second floor. As he started to climb, his flashlight beam caught something on the floor at the very top of the landing. It was a dark stain. It was blood. A cold dread filled the officer. He followed the trail of blood. It led him down a short hallway and into one of the bedrooms. And there, sprawled out on a bed, he found a woman. It was Dorothy. She had been brutally attacked. She had been stabbed to death. The investigation that followed would uncover one of the most tragic and bizarre coincidences imaginable. It would turn out that after Charles had made his daring escape, leaving the stranger stranded on the side of the road, that stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, was left fuming. His plan to rob Charles had failed, and now he was alone, on foot, in an unfamiliar neighborhood. He started walking, looking for a place to sleep, a place to lie low for the night. He wandered through the quiet streets, looking for an easy target. And then, by pure random horrible chance, he selected a house. He chose the house that just happened to belong to Dorothy, Charles's mother. He broke in through her back door, smashing the window. The noise woke Dorothy up. The 70-year-old woman, hearing an intruder in her home, bravely came down the stairs to confront him. Gilbert Cannon was caught completely by surprise. He panicked. He knew he couldn't leave a witness behind, someone who could see his face and identify him to the police. So, he attacked her. He used the only weapon he had, the same screwdriver he had threatened Charles with just an hour earlier. He stabbed her repeatedly, ensuring she couldn't call for help, ensuring she couldn't identify him. Later, when Gilbert was arrested and interrogated, he would tell the police the entire story. He confirmed that the initial attack on Charles was completely random. He had just been at the fast food restaurant, he saw Charles getting into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. It was a simple, opportunistic crime. And then, after the robbery failed, when he was just looking for a place to hide, he broke into the first house that looked easy. He had no idea who lived there. When the woman, Dorothy, came down the stairs, he attacked her and killed her, never knowing, not for a single second, that this woman was the mother of the very same man he had tried to rob just an hour before. The entire night, from the moment Charles decided to stop for food to the moment the officer discovered Dorothy's body, was one big, horrifying, and unbelievable coincidence. Gilbert Cannon would eventually plead guilty to the murder of Dorothy Holden. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Charles Holden, the aftermath was a life sentence of its own. He had to live with the crushing weight of that night. He had to live with the endless, agonizing questions. What if he had just driven away from the fast food parking lot? What if he had taken the stranger all the way to the hospital? What if he had dropped him off on a different street? It's a chain of events so unlikely, so tragic, it almost defies belief. A reminder that sometimes the most terrible things happen for no reason at all. Some of the scariest stories aren't terrifying because they were carefully planned, they're terrifying because they happened completely by chance. A random ride home. A town pushed past its breaking point. And 2 thieves who vanished without a trace. 3 stories that sound unbelievable, but actually happened. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.
In the world of extreme sports, some individuals are driven by a quiet internal need to find where their limits lie and then push slightly past them. Throughout the 1990s, Andrew McCauley was exactly that kind of individual. He was an elite Australian mountaineer and rock climber, known within the community for establishing dozens of difficult big wall climbing routes across Australia. When he traveled to famous climbing regions like New Zealand, Patagonia, and the Himalayas, he deliberately ignored the marquee peaks, the famous mountains that brought fame and media attention. Instead, McCauley sought out obscure, lesser-known peaks that offered superior complexity and technical challenge. To him, the reward was the purity of the struggle, not the applause at the summit. However, the trajectory of his life altered drastically in 1998. During a challenging climb, McCauley suffered a catastrophic 30-meter fall, shattering his knee. The injury was severe enough to ensure that he would never again climb at an elite, world-class level. For a man whose identity was entirely wrapped up in testing his physical boundaries, the diagnosis felt like a definitive ending. Yet, this massive setback ultimately birthed his life's true passion, sea kayaking. McCauley discovered that kayaking allowed him to bypass his physical limitations, as the sport relied almost entirely on upper body strength and core stability rather than the heavy use of his legs. He adapted to the water with astonishing speed. Applying the same intense drive that fueled his mountaineering career, McCauley began conquering the most dangerous open ocean kayaking routes around Australia and New Zealand. Before long, he had successfully completed almost every major open water challenge the region had to offer. Only one ultimate, unconquered frontier remained: the Tasman Sea. The Tasman Sea is a notoriously violent stretch of water separating Australia and New Zealand. Spanning approximately 1,000 miles, it is plagued by volatile weather patterns, brutal winds, and massive swells. McCauley calculated that the solo journey would take him at least 30 days, perhaps slightly longer depending on the conditions. From the outset, McCauley knew that his primary adversary would not be his own mental or physical exhaustion, but the ocean itself. Because a human being cannot accurately forecast or avoid bad weather over a 30-day window, a standard weather window did not exist for this journey. Surviving the Tasman was not a matter of if he would hit a storm, but how he and his vessel would endure the storms when they inevitably arrived. Other adventurers who had previously attempted to cross the Tasman Sea relied on highly specialized, custom-built kayaks. These vessels featured heavy integrated canopies and mechanical self-righting systems designed to automatically pop the kayak back upright if it flipped over. McCauley, true to his purist mountaineering roots, rejected these elaborate designs. He did not want the bells and whistles of modern technology. He wanted a pure, direct relationship between himself, his paddle, and the sea. Nevertheless, he required some form of shelter to survive overnight storms and sleep safely. To solve this, McCauley went into his own backyard and manufactured a crude, homemade fiberglass capsule that resembled a large trash can lid. This custom pod was designed to sit directly over his cockpit. When he needed to paddle, the capsule was stored on the back deck of his kayak. When a storm rolled in or when it was time to sleep, he could pull the structure over himself, creating a completely sealed, watertight capsule. If the kayak flipped in the middle of the night, the capsule would provide enough buoyancy to keep him from sinking and drowning. Seeking to bring a bit of levity to his austere vessel, McCauley painted a large, bright smiley face on the fiberglass dome and named it Casper. On the 11th of January, 2007, after months of meticulous physical preparation and gear testing, the moment of departure finally arrived. On the shores of Australia, Andrew McCauley kissed his wife Vicky and their young son goodbye. He climbed into his kayak, secured his gear alongside Casper, and paddled away from the coastline into the vast expanse of the open ocean. For the first two-thirds of the trans-Tasman journey, Macaulay's meticulous planning seemed to pay off perfectly. He established a disciplined routine, checking in regularly via his satellite radio to update his support team on his progress. His supplies of food and fresh water were holding up well, his physical conditioning was keeping exhaustion at bay, and his custom-built capsule, Casper, worked exactly as intended, allowing him to seal himself away at night to get crucial hours of sleep. However, as he entered the final third of the 1,000-mile journey, the predictable luck of the early weeks evaporated. The severe, chaotic weather systems that he had anticipated began rolling in back to back, offering him no time to recover between storms. The Tasman Sea was living up to its brutal reputation. During one particularly ferocious storm, the ocean transformed into a chaotic wall of moving water. Macaulay was forced to retreat entirely inside his cockpit, locking himself beneath Casper as 3 zero-foot waves hammered his small craft. For 28 consecutive hours, he remained trapped in total darkness inside the cramped, suffocating fiberglass capsule. Outside, the immense waves wreaked absolute havoc, violently flipping his kayak over multiple times. Inside the vessel, Macaulay had access to an emergency GPS distress beacon. A single press of that button would have immediately transmitted his exact coordinates to international rescue crews, who would have deployed ships and aircraft to save his life. Yet, despite being violently thrashed around by mountain-sized waves in total isolation, Macaulay refused to press it. Much like his aversion to factory-modified kayaks, he possessed a fierce independence and did not want outside intervention to compromise the purity of his solo achievement. Instead of signaling for help, Macaulay chose to maintain a brave, stoic front for those watching from the shore. Once the worst of the 2 8-hour storm finally subsided and he was able to open the capsule, he used his satellite device to send a brief, characteristically sarcastic text message to a friend on land. Making light of a terrifying ordeal that would have broken most people, the text simply read, "No picnic today." With the storm behind him, Macaulay adjusted his gear, gripped his paddle, and continued to push eastward toward New Zealand, completely unaware of the final trials the ocean had in store for him. Next story, Zach Bowen and Addie Hall, the Katrina survivors. In the humid summer of 2005, the vibrant and chaotic streets of New Orleans brought together 2 bartenders named Zach Bowen and Addie Hall. To those who observed them from the outside, they seemed like an intriguing but highly volatile match. Addie was a woman with a fiercely protective and unpredictable personality. She often used a sharp, mean girl persona as a defense mechanism and a way of flirting, testing the men around her to see if they possessed the strength to handle her. It turned out that she had intense, sudden outbursts of anger that could flare up instantly and vanish just as quickly. Zach, meanwhile, was charming, but possessed a dark undercurrent and a volatile temper of his own. In many ways, they were mirrors of each other, sharing a chaotic energy that manifested in intense, frequent arguments. During the first few weeks of their relationship, their mutual friends openly doubted they would last more than a month, predicting that their explosive chemistry would inevitably burn the relationship to the ground. However, nature intervened before their own internal drama could tear them apart. Just weeks after they began dating, Hurricane Katrina gathered strength in the Gulf of Mexico and veered directly toward New Orleans, triggering mandatory evacuations and sending hundreds of thousands of residents fleeing for safety. Instead of joining the exodus, Zach and Addie made a fateful, impulsive decision to stay behind. They chose to bunker down together in the French Quarter and ride out one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. When the storm struck, submerging vast swaths of the city and knocking out power, clean water, and law enforcement, the sheer survival aspect of the crisis acted as a strange catalyst for the young couple. Amid the howling winds and rising waters, their volatile friction transformed into an intense, codependent bond. They fell deeply, madly in love, becoming entirely inseparable in a city that had suddenly been cut off from the rest of the world. As the floodwaters stabilized and the immediate danger passed, the French Quarter became an isolated island of survivalists, and Zack and Addie stepped into the void as unlikely leaders. Gathering whatever food they could find and pooling together an enormous supply of alcohol from their apartment, they constructed a makeshift open-air bar right on the street. While the rest of the city grappled with unprecedented tragedy, Zack and Addie spent their days cooking large meals for their struggling neighbors and handing out free drinks to anyone walking by. They brought a sense of defiant joy and colorful resilience to a community that had lost everything. This striking tale of romance blooming in the ruins of a disaster quickly caught the attention of national media outlets. Journalists looking for stories of human resilience flocked to them, and the New York Times even featured the couple in a prominent article about the post-Katrina spirit. For a fleeting, surreal moment in time, Zack and Addie felt like the undisputed king and queen of the French Quarter, living a bohemian dream built on the backdrop of a catastrophe. But disasters eventually end, and reality has a way of dismantling illusions. As the months pressed on, the long and painful process of rebuilding New Orleans began. Electricity was systematically restored to the neighborhoods, businesses reopened, citizens moved back into their homes, and the standard demands of daily employment returned. The lawless, romantic frontier that had allowed Zack and Addie's relationship to thrive evaporated, forcing them back into a conventional lifestyle that neither of them was truly equipped to handle. For the next year, the couple struggled heavily under the weight of mounting financial pressure. As the bills piled up and the daily grind set in, the old, vicious arguments returned with a vengeance. Without a literal hurricane to fight against, they turned their destructive energies entirely on each other, engaging in constant, toxic, screaming matches that alienated their friends and left their relationship fractured beyond repair. By October 2006, realizing that their relationship was rapidly disintegrating, they decided that a drastic change of scenery was their only hope for a fresh start. Desperate to escape the bad memories of their old apartment, they found a small, historic flat located directly above the famed Voodoo Temple on Rampart Street. They made a quick cash offer and moved in immediately, hoping the unique space would reinvigorate their dying romance. Instead, the move only accelerated their descent. Shortly after unpacking, Addie made a devastating discovery. Zack had been cheating on her. Furious and entirely done with his betrayal, Addie went directly to the landlord and demanded that Zack's name be legally removed from the lease, preparing to evict him from her life for good. When Zack found out that he was being pushed out of the apartment before Addie even had the chance to officially confront him, it triggered an incredibly dark, wicked fight between the two, a confrontation far more sinister than any they had experienced before. A few days later, a strange quiet fell over the apartment. Zack showed up for his bartending shift at a local venue, but his coworkers immediately noticed that his demeanor had completely changed. He pulled a hat down low over his eyes, wore dark sunglasses indoors, and remained completely silent, refusing to engage with anyone. When worried friends asked him what was wrong, he simply muttered that he was fine and quickly walked away. Around the same time, Addie uncharacteristically failed to show up for her shifts at work. When people questioned Zack about her whereabouts, he casually lied, claiming that they had gotten into a massive blowout fight and that Addie had packed her bags and left New Orleans to return to her hometown in North Carolina. Given Addie's highly unpredictable nature and volatile history, many people accepted the explanation, assuming she had simply walked away from the toxic relationship. The horrifying truth came to light on the 17th of October, 2006. The police received an emergency call from an Omni Hotel staff member who had spotted a motionless body lying on the rooftop of their multi-story parking garage. When authorities arrived at the scene, they found Zack Bowen deceased from a high-impact fall. It was clear he had jumped from the roof, but the true horror began when investigators searched his pockets for identification. In his back pocket, police discovered a lengthy, meticulously written suicide note addressed directly to them. The note explicitly stated that his death was no accident, and that he had taken his own life because he had taken the life of another. He directed the police to the Rampart Street apartment, stating they would find the body of his girlfriend, Addie Hall. When police officers rushed to the address over the Voodoo Temple, they were completely unprepared for the gruesome scene awaiting them. Upon crossing the threshold, the officers were immediately struck by a severe, unnatural drop in temperature. Zach had intentionally cranked the apartment's air conditioning units to the lowest possible setting to preserve the scene. Looking around the dimly lit rooms, they saw chaotic, unsettling messages spray-painted in black ink all over the walls. Among lines declaring his own total failure as a human being, Zach had spray-painted stark arrows pointing directly toward the kitchen, accompanied by the chilling instruction to look in the oven. Following the grim signs into the kitchen, the officers opened the oven door and discovered the dismembered, cooked remains of Addie Hall with additional body parts placed in pots on top of the stove. Hidden inside Addie's personal journal, police found a gruesome 8-page confession written by Zach. He detailed how, in a fit of rage, he had strangled Addie to death before using his bartending tools to dismember her, attempting to cook her remains to make them easier to dispose of. However, overcome by horror at his own actions, he found himself unable to finish the job, leaving a final apology spray-painted on the kitchen wall before walking to the hotel to end his own life. Today, in a bizarre twist of dark tourism and urban reality, that very same apartment on Rampart Street is still rented out to tenants, complete with the exact same stove where the tragedy occurred. Next story, Hisashi Ouchi, the human guinea pig. In the late autumn of 1999, a quiet technician named Hisashi Ouchi was living a perfectly ordinary life in Japan. He was a married man, a devoted father to a young son, an avid rugby enthusiast from his high school days, and a regular smoker who went about his daily routine without any inkling that his name would soon become synonymous with one of the most horrific medical and industrial tragedies in human history. Ouchi was employed at the JCO nuclear fuel processing plant located in the village of Tokaimura, a hub for Japan's nuclear industry. His specific task at the time was to help prepare a highly specialized liquid nuclear fuel intended for a fast breeder experimental reactor named Joyo. However, behind the clean, sterile exterior of the facility lay a corporate culture deeply corrupted by a desire to cut corners. Since 1993, the plant's parent company, JCO, had systematically abandoned strict government safety regulations to prioritize corporate profitability and speed. To facilitate this dangerous acceleration, management implemented an illegal, highly unregulated in-house operating manual known among the staff as the Shadow Guide. This Shadow Guide actively encouraged workers to bypass mandatory automated safety systems and perform highly volatile chemical mixtures by hand. The fatal consequence of this corporate negligence manifested on the morning of the 30th of September 1999. Hisashi Ouchi and two of his colleagues were working in the purification room, rushing to complete a batch of Joyo fuel. Following the hazardous protocols outlined in the Shadow Guide, Ouchi stood directly over a massive steel precipitation tank, physically holding a plastic funnel in place. A coworker stood on a platform above him, manually pouring a highly concentrated liquid uranyl nitrate solution from a bucket through the funnel and into the tank. The precipitation tank, however, was fundamentally never engineered or shaped to hold that massive volume of enriched uranium at one time. As the coworker poured the 7th bucket into the vessel, the concentration of uranium reached a critical mass. The geometry of the tank allowed the atoms to undergo a spontaneous, runaway nuclear chain reaction. A colleague sitting several meters away at a desk later described hearing an incredibly loud metallic bang, which was instantly accompanied by a brilliant, blinding flash of eerie blue light that filled the entire room. This blue flash was Cherenkov radiation, the visual manifestation of an immense lethal wave of ionizing radiation ripping through the atmosphere. Because Ouchie was leaning directly over the tank, his entire body absorbed the absolute brunt of the energetic burst. Immediately following the flash, the room's radiation alarms blared, and Ouchie was struck by instantaneous violent bouts of vomiting, lightheadedness, and severe dizziness. He was evacuated from the building and quickly airlifted to the University of Tokyo Hospital. Upon his arrival, medical professionals were initially astonished and deeply misled by his physical appearance. Aside from some mild redness and swelling on his right arm, the arm closest to the funnel, Ouchie bore absolutely no visible physical trauma. He had no thermal burns, no bleeding lacerations, and no broken bones. He was completely conscious, lucid, in remarkably good spirits, and even joked with the nursing staff about how eager he was to get back home to his family. But the diagnostic data painted a catastrophic reality. Dosimetry reports revealed that Ouchie had been bombarded with a staggering 17 sieverts of radiation. To put this into perspective, a dose of 8 sieverts is universally considered fatal to humans. Ouchie had received the highest documented dose of radiation any human being had ever survived in recorded history. Medical specialists soon realized that Ouchie was trapped in what radiologists call the walking ghost phase of acute radiation syndrome. Although he looked and spoke like a healthy living person, he was, from a cellular perspective, already a corpse. The massive influx of ionizing radiation had acted like a microscopic machine gun, completely obliterating the chromosomes inside his DNA. His body had completely lost the essential genetic blueprint required to replicate cells. Human life relies on constant cellular regeneration. As old cells naturally die off, the body replaces them to maintain tissue integrity. In Ouchie's case, his body could no longer create a single new cell. His existing cells were dying off rapidly, and there was absolutely no biological mechanism left to replace them. He was completely conscious and alive to watch his own body systematically dissolve from the inside out. Initially, Ouchie himself did not understand the absolute gravity of his condition. Having never experienced radiation sickness, he assumed that since he had survived the first few days, the worst was behind him. He expressed a naive belief that the maximum consequence of the accident might be the development of leukemia later in life, and his primary annoyance was merely having to stay in a hospital bed away from his son. However, by the 3rd week, the horrific reality of chromosome destruction took hold. His internal organs began to fail as the lining of his gastrointestinal tract sloughed off completely, causing his intestines to hemorrhage uncontrollably. Simultaneously, his skin began to liquefy and peel away from his flesh in massive sheets. Without cellular replication, his body could not heal the raw tissue underneath. To prevent his vital bodily fluids and blood from continuously leaking out, doctors attempted numerous advanced skin grafts, but because his underlying tissue lacked the genetic capability to bond with the new skin, every single graft failed and rotted away. Medical staff resorted to wrapping his entire body in thick layers of medical gauze, leaving him looking like a living mummy. By late November, roughly 2 months into the ordeal, the pain escalated to an agonizing, unimaginable threshold that the human mind could not tolerate while conscious. Doctors placed Ouchie into a medically induced coma and attached him to continuous life support machine. While he was comatose, his heart stopped beating entirely due to the extreme stress on his cardiovascular system. Rather than letting him pass away peacefully, the medical team resuscitated him, restarting his heart 3 separate times over the course of his stay. During brief, agonizing windows where his sedation was lowered and he regained a modicum of consciousness, Ouchie used his remaining strength to scream at the doctors, pleading with them to stop the treatments, famously declaring, "I am not a guinea pig." The medical team, however, was caught in a profound ethical dilemma. They justified their relentless intervention by arguing that keeping him alive allowed them to test cutting-edge treatments such as experimental stem cell transplants that could potentially save future radiation victims. Yet, this pursuit meant that Ouchie was subjected to a prolonged artificial existence of pure torture. Finally, after recognizing the futility of their efforts and honoring the immense grief of his family, a formal do not resuscitate order was implemented. On the 21st of December 1999, after enduring 83 days of unparalleled physiological agony, Hisashi Ouchie's heart stopped for the final time, and he was finally permitted to die. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya!
Around 6:30 inches the evening on the 10th of December 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff was sitting inside a small guard shack at the Kenotok copper mine in northern Utah. He had a college textbook open in front of him, trying to study. The shack he was in was tiny, barely big enough for one person, with windows on all four sides. And when Brian looked out of those windows, all he saw was darkness. The sun had set a while ago, and this part of the mine was completely isolated. There were no streetlights, no other buildings nearby. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the fresh snow on the ground, which made everything outside look kind of eerie and desolate. Brian had been a security guard at this mine for just over a year, but he'd only been assigned to this specific guard shack for a couple of weeks. And in his opinion, it was the absolute worst post he could have possibly gotten. His job was to stand guard at a chain-link gate that blocked off a remote service road leading deep into the canyons. Because it was such an out-of-the-way entrance to the mine, almost no vehicles ever came through. So most of the time, the job was just incredibly boring. He would just sit there for hours watching the snowfall. But at the same time, it was also a very dangerous post. The Kennecott copper mine was famous. People called it the richest hole on Earth because of the massive amounts of copper, gold, and silver buried in the ground there. And all that valuable material made the mine a huge target for thieves. In just the last few months alone, over $150,000 worth of equipment and precious metals had been stolen. So Brian was always a little on edge out here, all by himself in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just the pitch blackness that got to him. It was also the fact that he was totally unarmed. The company didn't provide guards with any weapons. He didn't even have security cameras. If he ran into a group of thieves, his only defense was a telephone on his desk to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been completely normal. It was slow, quiet, and uneventful. So Brian decided to use the downtime to get some studying in. He was in nursing school, and his final exams were just a few days away. He was poring over his notes and textbooks, trying to cram as much information as he could into his head. While he was studying, he took out a thermos. His wife had packed him some soup for dinner. He unscrewed the lid, and just as he was about to take his first spoonful, the phone on his desk started ringing. Brian immediately hesitated. He knew there was a very good chance it was his wife Jennifer on the other end. But things at home right now were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had taken on this night shift at the mine to help pay the bills while he was in nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, money was incredibly tight. And to make things even more stressful, Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. The pressure of balancing school, work, and raising a family had been putting a huge strain on their marriage. About a month ago, Brian had hit a breaking point. He'd actually walked out on his family. He left a simple note for Jennifer, saying he just needed some time alone to think things over. Then he drove to the mine, turned in his security badge, and told his boss he was quitting. After that, he just left town. He spent almost a week in Las Vegas, and then he drove all the way out to San Francisco. He was trying to clear his head, but while he was out there, he got a call. His daughter, back home in Utah, was in the emergency room with a bad case of pneumonia. For Brian, that was the wake-up call he needed. He realized he couldn't live with himself if he actually abandoned his family for good. So he immediately got in his car and drove straight back to Utah to be with Jennifer and his daughter. His daughter, thankfully, made a full recovery. And Jennifer, despite him just up and leaving them, she agreed to take him back. But just because he was home didn't mean things went back to normal. There was this constant tension hanging over their relationship. Jennifer hadn't fully forgiven him for what he'd done, and Brian felt like he was walking on eggshells all the time. So now, sitting in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath before picking up the ringing phone. It was Jennifer. He chatted with her for a few minutes, trying to keep the conversation light. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something through the window. It was a flash of headlights, coming up the service road directly towards his guard shack. He told Jennifer he had to go, hung up the phone, and stepped outside to meet the vehicle that was pulling up. About an hour and a half later, around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, a supervisor named Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. He noticed the lights were on inside the shack, but he couldn't see anyone moving around in there. Todd thought this was pretty strange. Brian was under strict orders not to leave his post for any reason. That was the most important rule of the job. You stay put, no matter what. What made it even weirder was that Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. This post was so far away from anything else on the mine property, there was literally nowhere for Brian to go without his car, especially not in the freezing cold. So where was he? Todd was starting to feel a little uneasy. He parked his own vehicle, got out, and walked over to the shack. He opened the door and stepped inside. The tiny space was empty. Brian was gone. But on the desk, Todd saw Brian's hat and his half-eaten thermos of soup. It looked like he had just gotten up and walked away in the middle of his dinner. At this point, Todd knew something was wrong. He picked up the phone inside the shack and called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department to report a missing person. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig was driving down a dark, snowy desert road heading towards the Kennetock copper mine. Everyone in law enforcement knew this mine was a hotbed for theft. So when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had vanished in the middle of his shift, Detective Lassig didn't waste any time. The first thought was that this could be related to thieves. Maybe they had kidnapped Brian, or worse. When Lassig pulled up to the main entrance of the mine, he saw another vehicle parked there. It flashed its headlights at him. A man in a security guard uniform rolled down his window and waved Lassig over. Lassig pulled up alongside him, and the man introduced himself as Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had made the call about the missing guard. Todd started his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so Lassig did. He followed Todd's taillights deeper into the darkness, down a winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennetock mine was huge, covering 3 square miles of rocky, mountainous terrain. They drove for a solid 10 minutes before Lassig finally saw a single light up ahead. It was the guard shack where Brian had been stationed. The two men parked their cars and got out. Todd pointed to the shack and told Detective Lassig that this was where Brian was supposed to be. Lassig pulled out a flashlight and aimed it at the ground around the shack, but there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any potential footprints or tire tracks were already covered up. So, Lassig stepped inside the shack. At first glance, everything looked normal. There was no blood, nothing was knocked over, no signs of any kind of struggle. But there on the desk was Brian's hat and that half-eaten thermos of soup. It was a strange little detail that just didn't feel right. Lassig was trying to process the scene, running through different theories in his head, looking for any clue about what might have happened. As he was thinking, the phone on the desk rang again. Detective Lassig just picked it up. He answered, and a woman on the other end sounded surprised. She said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to call her husband Brian. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department and that her husband had left his post sometime during the night and couldn't be found. He was literally in the middle of investigating his disappearance. He then asked Jennifer when she had last spoken to Brian. Jennifer, obviously shocked by the news, told him she had just talked to him a couple of hours ago. She said they were on the phone and then Brian suddenly had to hang up because he saw a car approaching the shack. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about the car or who might be driving it. But Jennifer said no. He just said a car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was a bit disappointed there wasn't more information, but he thanked Jennifer and promised to be in touch as soon as he knew anything. He hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the tiny room. But just a few seconds later, the phone rang again. Lassig picked it up. And again, a woman on the line said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer, and she was asking where he was. But as Lassig was listening, he realized something was very wrong. This woman's voice sounded nothing like the woman he had just spoken to a minute ago, who had also claimed to be Jennifer. And this second woman clearly had no idea about their previous conversation. He was talking to two different people, both of them claiming to be Brian Ruff's wife. Obviously, only one of them could be telling the truth, which meant one of these women had to be lying. A few days later, in mid-December of 1991, Detective Manny Lassig was sitting at the dining room table in the Ruffs' home. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and was sitting across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. Brian was still missing, and the investigation had been moving at a snail's pace. For the first few days, everyone was kind of hoping that Brian would just show up on his own, that maybe he had run off again like he had before. But as the days turned into a week, that seemed less and less likely. By now, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack that night. He quickly confirmed that one of the calls had come from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number. So, he was pretty sure he was now sitting with the real Jennifer Ruff. But he was still trying to figure out why another woman would call and impersonate her. And the timing of the calls was just too strange to be a coincidence. One right after the other. It was bizarre. So, as Lassig sat across from Jennifer, he started by asking her for her alibi. Where had she been on the night Brian disappeared? She told him she had been at the hospital all night, working a long shift. She even gave Lassig the names of several of her coworkers who could back up her story. Then, Lassig changed the subject completely. He looked her in the eye and asked her, point blank, if there was any chance her husband could have been having an affair. Were there other women in his life? Had he been acting strange or secretive lately? The reason he asked, of course, was because of that second mysterious phone call. He knew there was another woman out there, even if Jennifer didn't. When Jennifer heard the question, she looked down at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up at him and said, yes, she was suspicious of that. She told Lassig all about the problems they'd been having in their marriage. She told him how, just the month before, Brian had suddenly run off, saying he needed time alone. He was gone for a week with no contact, until he just showed up again, begging her to take him back. When Lassig heard that, he leaned back in his chair. He started to wonder if this whole investigation was a waste of time. If Brian had a history of just taking off without warning, what was to stop him from doing it again? Maybe this wasn't a crime at all. Maybe Brian would just turn up in a few days, just like last time. But Jennifer must have sensed what he was thinking because she quickly added that the first time he left, he had at least left a note. And he'd told his boss he was quitting. There was some kind of warning. She insisted that it was not like Brian to just vanish in the middle of his shift like this, leaving his dinner half-eaten. He had his faults, she said, but this was different. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer if she knew where Brian had gone during that week he was away. In response, Jennifer got up and handed him a piece of mail from a nearby table. It was a credit card bill that had arrived that week, addressed to Brian. She explained she was confused when she saw it because as far as she knew, Brian didn't even have a credit card. But apparently he did, and he had used it a lot while he was gone to pay for hotels, meals, and other things. Lassig took the bill and started looking it over. He saw a lot of charges from Las Vegas and San Francisco, and the amounts for restaurant meals and room service seemed a little high for just one person. He looked up from the bill at Jennifer, and he could tell from the look on her face that they had both come to the same conclusion. When Brian was away that week, he probably hadn't been alone. Jennifer then handed Lassig another piece of paper. It was their phone bill, with a detailed list of every call made and received over the past month. Jennifer said there were a bunch of numbers on the list that she didn't recognize. She thought maybe one of them belonged to the person Brian had been traveling with. As Lassig looked over the list of numbers, one of them immediately jumped out at him. It was the same number that the second woman, the fake Jennifer, had called from on the night Brian disappeared. Later that same day, Lassig was sitting in the living room of the house associated with that phone number. Across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kenotok mine, the same place Brian worked. Dale wasn't home at the moment, and Lassig wanted to talk to Christy alone before he got back. So, he didn't beat around the bush. He told Christy that he was almost certain she and Brian had been having an affair. Before she could even respond, he pulled out the credit card bill Jennifer had given him and showed her the evidence. For a second, Christy looked like she was going to deny it. But then her face crumbled, and she broke down and admitted everything. She said she and Brian had been seeing each other for a while. She confirmed that they had run away together the month before for about a week. And even though they had both come back to their families, she said they were still very much in touch. She said that's why she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared. She was just calling to talk to him. But when a strange man's voice answered the phone, Detective Lassig, she said she panicked. On instinct, she just lied and pretended to be Jennifer, his wife, so that their affair wouldn't be discovered. But she was very clear about one thing. She hadn't heard from Brian since that night, and she had no idea what happened to him. Lassig sat back and just watched her for a moment. She seemed genuinely worried about Brian. And even though her call to the guard shack was incredibly suspicious, her explanation for it actually made a twisted kind of sense. Still, he wasn't about to rule her out as a suspect just yet. And now, her husband Dale was also a primary suspect. If he had found out about his wife's affair with his friend and coworker, he would have a powerful motive for revenge. The next day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Dale Bradley was already sitting there, waiting for him. The moment Lassig came in, Dale asked if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And to Lassig, Dale's concern seemed real. He sat down and asked Dale how long he'd known Brian. Dale said they'd met about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they had become pretty good friends. They even hung out together outside of work sometimes. Then, trying to catch him off guard, Lassig abruptly changed the subject and asked Dale directly about his wife's affair with Brian. Dale looked completely stunned. He said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. Lassig explained what his wife had already confessed to. Dale seemed genuinely devastated. The idea that his wife was cheating on him, especially with a man he considered a close friend, was clearly a huge shock. As Dale was trying to process this, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. Dale, still reeling from the news, took a moment to compose himself. He said that on that night his car had actually gotten stuck in the snow. He was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, which was almost an hour's drive from the mine. He said he even had to call a friend to come and pull his car out of the snowbank, and then he gave Lassig the friend's name so he could verify the story. After writing down the name, Lassig told Dale he wanted him to take a polygraph test. He also said they would need to search his car. Dale agreed to both requests without any hesitation at all. A few weeks later, Lassig was walking across the parking lot at the Kenotok mine. Brian still hadn't been found, and the investigation felt like it was hitting one dead end after another. Dale Bradley and his wife Christy had both taken polygraph tests, and they had both passed. Lassig had also searched Dale's red Mustang, but he found no evidence inside that connected him to Brian's disappearance. On top of that, the friend Dale mentioned had confirmed his story. He said yes, he had gone to help Dale get his Mustang out of the snow that night. So Dale's alibi seemed solid. At that point, both Dale and Christie were unofficially moved off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the possibility that Jennifer, Brian's actual wife, might have been involved. Her co-workers confirmed she was at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she had hired someone to harm Brian. She certainly had a motive. But with no evidence against her and still no body, all Lassig had was a gut feeling, and that wasn't enough. But then, just a few days ago, Lassig got a new lead that sent the investigation in a completely new direction. That's why he was back at the Kennetock mine to talk to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, again. Lassig went into the office building and found Todd's office. When Todd saw him, he jumped up from his desk and eagerly greeted him, saying he would do anything he could to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told him to sit back down. Then Lassig sat down, pulled out a tape recorder, and hit the record button. He then told Todd why he was really there. 2 of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metals and equipment from the mine and selling it all at local pawn shops. An internal investigation had uncovered a whole ring of employees who were involved in the thefts. Todd started to look nervous. He shifted in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he had nothing to do with it. He said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he knew that, and that wasn't why he was there. He explained that when he reviewed the records from the theft investigation, he discovered that Brian had been the one who had reported some of his coworkers for stealing. So now, Lassig had a new theory. What if, on the night he disappeared, Brian had stopped a coworker's car, found stolen materials inside, and they had killed him to silence him? Todd leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful for a moment. Then he admitted that, yeah, that was possible. He then started telling Detective Lassig about several places on the mine's property where a body could be hidden. As an example, he suggested the giant gravel pile by the concentrator, a machine that crushes minerals and grinds them into dust. Todd explained that if Brian's body had been placed there, it would have been sucked into the grinders and pulverized along with the rocks. He would be completely gone. Detective Lassig was taken aback by how specific Todd was being. It was like he had already thought about this in great detail. Sensing something was off, Lassig just let Todd keep talking. And Todd did. He kept offering up one gruesome theory after another about what could have happened to Brian. At one point, he suggested Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen on top of him, burying him completely. He said if that happened, Brian would be under several tons of rock by now, and the police would never, ever find him. On the 10th of July, 1993, a full year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig was driving through a barren stretch of desert in Utah, about 50 miles south of the Kennetock mine. There had been absolutely no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours searching the mine with police dogs and helicopters looking for any sign of Brian. But they had found nothing. Not a single trace. By this point, Lassig was sure that foul play was involved. But it was impossible to prove a murder without a body and without any evidence tying his suspects to the crime. For months, his team had investigated every single security guard at the mine, especially the ones involved in the theft ring. But they had verified that every guard who was on duty that night was at their assigned post when Brian vanished. And they had checked the alibis of everyone who wasn't scheduled to work. They couldn't link a single one of them to Brian's disappearance. That included his supervisor, Todd Fallows, who, despite his strangely specific theories, was eventually linked to the theft ring, but had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and her husband Dale, they had been ruled out early on. Their alibis checked out, they passed lie detector tests, and nothing new had come up in the last year and a half to make them suspects again. And Brian's wife, Jennifer, also remained off the list. She had a strong motive, but her alibi of being at work was airtight and they could find no connection between her and any possible accomplice. So after more than a year of dead ends, the case had gone completely cold. But that morning, the investigation had suddenly come back to life. A group of campers had called the sheriff's department to report finding skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew it was a long shot, but he was hoping it might be Brian. When he arrived at the location the campers had described, he got out of his car and walked across the dry, cracked earth to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow, makeshift grave. The skeleton was still wearing clothes, a dust-covered dark blue jacket. Lassig crouched down to get a better look, and he saw that it was a security guard's uniform. He put on a pair of gloves and carefully searched the pockets of the jacket. His fingers closed around a wallet. He pulled it out, opened it, and found an ID card and credit cards, all with the name Brian Ruff. It seemed clear that this was Brian's body. But because it was so decomposed, they would need to check dental records to be 100% sure, and that would take some time. While the crime scene techs carefully removed the remains, Lassig stayed behind with a K9 unit to search the area for any other evidence. And sure enough, just a few feet away from the grave, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells scattered in the dirt. It looked like Brian had been shot 5 times and then buried. Then, a few yards away from the shells, a police dog started barking. An officer called Lassig over. The officer was holding up a black work boot. There was a clear bullet hole right through the leather. Lassig was sure the boot had to be Brian's. But aside from the body and the boot, 18 months of brutal desert weather, scorching heat, wind, sand, snow, and rain had erased almost every other trace of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig now knew where and how Brian had been killed, he was worried he was no closer to figuring out who had done it. 12 years passed. On the 30th of April, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office received a phone call. Park had been assigned to the cold case unit at the beginning of the year, and his full-time job was to solve old, forgotten crimes. The detective on the phone was from the sheriff's department in the next county over. He was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases. Specifically, the murder of Brian Ruff. After the call, Park hung up the phone and went straight to his filing cabinet. He dug through the old dusty files until he found the one for Brian Ruff. He sat down at his desk and began sorting through the stacks of decade-old papers. And as he read, he noticed a tiny piece of evidence that the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized this small detail was the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on all the forensic evidence, this is what police now believe happened to Brian Ruff on the night of the 10th of December, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down that dark, winding service road toward the isolated part of the Kennetock mine. Up ahead, they saw the single light from Brian's small guard shack. The killer pulled their car right up to the shack and parked. When they got out, Brian came out of the shack to see who it was. He waved hello. The killer waved back and walked towards Brian. And as soon as they were close enough, they grabbed Brian, spun him around, and tied his hands behind his back. Before Brian could even react, the killer forced him into the back of their vehicle. The killer then got into the driver's seat, made a U-turn, and sped away from the mine, heading out towards the desert. As they drove, Brian was screaming and kicking in the back, trying desperately to escape. But the killer remained calm and just kept driving for nearly an hour until they reached another remote spot deep in the desert, about 50 miles away from the mine. They pulled off the road and stopped in an open, snow-covered patch of land. The killer got out, opened the back door, and dragged Brian out of the car. Brian was still fighting, but he was exhausted. He started pleading for his life, promising that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone what had happened. But the killer wasn't listening. They grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then, at gunpoint, forced him to dig his own grave in the frozen ground. When Brian was finished, the killer raised the shotgun and shot him 5 times. After Brian was dead, they pushed his body into the hole he had just dug. The killer then got back into their car, a red Mustang, but when they tried to drive away, the Mustang's tires spun in the snow. They were stuck. So, they had to make a phone call to a friend for help. The friend came out, having no idea that a murder had just been committed only a few feet away, and helped the killer get their car out of the snow. And then, the killer drove off into the night. The killer was Dale Bradley, the coworker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that his car had gotten stuck in the snow an hour away from the mine was true. But it wasn't an alibi. It was a confession. He was describing being stuck at the crime scene. The friend who came to help him was telling the truth when he confirmed the story to the police, but he had no idea he was helping a murderer flee the scene of the crime. The police never cross-referenced the location where Dale said he was stuck with the location where Brian's body was eventually found. And so, they mistakenly believed his story. Additionally, Dale had passed a polygraph test early in the investigation, which made him seem even less like a suspect. He and Christy eventually divorced, likely because of the affair, and Dale later remarried. But in 2005, when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered, the detective investigating her case noticed that Dale Bradley had now been close to 2 different people who had been murdered. He thought it was too much of a coincidence, so he called Detective Park, the cold case investigator. That phone call prompted Detective Park to take a fresh look at the entire Brian Ruff case file. And that's when he found the note about the tiny speck of red paint found on the sole of the black work boot that was discovered near Brian's body. Park had the paint speck reanalyzed, and he was able to match it perfectly to the paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale Bradley's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was arrested and charged with Brian Ruff's murder on the 19th of September 2005. In 2007, he accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for his second wife, Crystal, her murder case remains unsolved to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.
In the fall of 1985, a group of friends decided to spend their weekend hiking through the beautiful, rugged wilderness of the Angeles National Forest in Southern California. The air was cool, the leaves were changing color, and the trail they were following was peaceful and quiet. As they made their way down a long, winding dirt path, one of the hikers happened to glance off to the side, looking through the thick stand of pine trees and heavy brush that bordered the trail. Down in a small ravine running parallel to the path they were walking on, there was a small, shallow stream flowing gently over the rocks. The hiker stopped for a moment, scanning the water, when they noticed something that looked completely out of place. It was a dark, bulky shape lying in the middle of the shallow water, partially covered by the shadows of the overhanging branches and the surrounding foliage. The hiker pointed it out to the rest of the group, and they all stood there on the trail, trying to make out what it was. But from that distance, it was impossible to tell. Curious, and feeling a strange sense of unease, the group decided to leave the main trail. They began to carefully make their way down the steep, slippery slope of the ravine, pushing aside the scratchy bushes and stepping over fallen logs. As they got close to a vatch of the stream, the shape in the water began to take a recognizable form. And when they finally stood right at the water's edge, looking down into the shallow flow, they completely froze. They just stood there in absolute stunned silence, staring at the horrific sight. It was the body of a young girl lying face down in the water, pinned beneath a massive, heavy log. The hikers were completely terrified and deeply shaken. They scrambled back up the ravine and ran down the trail to find help. It would take investigators another 3 long years before they would finally understand the dark, twisted, and incredibly sad story behind what those hikers had just stumbled upon in the stream that afternoon. To truly understand how this awful tragedy came to pass, we have to go back to the beginning, to the ordinary, everyday life of a 17-year-old girl named Michelle Avila. Now, almost everyone who knew her just called her Missy. In 1985, Missy was a high school junior living in the working-class community of Arleta, California, which is located in the San Fernando Valley just north of Los Angeles. Physically, young Missy was extremely small. She was under 5 feet tall, and she barely weighed 95 pounds. She had a very delicate, almost fragile frame, but despite her tiny size, Missy had an absolutely massive presence. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately brought a bright, positive energy with her. She was incredibly popular at her high school, and it was easy to see why. For one thing, she was exceptionally beautiful, with long, dark hair, striking features, and a radiant smile. Boys and girls alike were constantly falling over themselves to get her attention, to be near her, or to try and win her affection. But what really made Missy stand out was her genuine kindness. She was not stuck up or arrogant in the slightest. Instead, she was incredibly warm, gentle, and friendly to everyone she met. She did not take herself too seriously, she loved to laugh, and she was always willing to help out a classmate or a friend who was going through a tough time. To anyone looking in from the outside, Missy seemed to have a wonderful, perfect life with a loving family and a huge circle of friends who adored her. But, as is so often the case in true crime, behind this picture-perfect exterior, there were some very dark and troubling things going on. Life for Missy was actually far from perfect. It turns out that a year earlier, during her sophomore year of high school, a completely false and highly malicious rumor had started circulating around the school. This rumor claimed that Missy was secretly sleeping with a bunch of boys who were already in committed, established relationships with other girls at the school. It was a nasty piece of gossip, and it was a complete and total lie. Missy was a sweet, respectful girl who would never dream of doing something like that to anyone. But in the fragile social ecosystem of a high school, facts do not always matter. By the time this rumor made its way to the actual girlfriends of these boys, the damage was already done. These girls believed the rumor completely. They did not bother to ask Missy for her side of the story, nor did they look for any proof. They just wanted revenge. And so, one afternoon after school, as Missy walked out of the building and toward the parking lot, a group of these angry girls ambushed her. They ganged up on her, surrounded her, and began to beat her up. The attack was brutal and relentless. They knocked her to the ground, kicking and punching her, leaving her bruised, battered, and utterly terrified. Missy eventually managed to get away and make her way home, but when her family saw the state she was in, they were absolutely furious. Missy's mother, Irene, and the rest of the family immediately decided that they were not going to let this slide. They went straight to the police and pressed charges against the girl who had led the brutal attack, a teenager named Sonia Ballen. But pressing charges did not bring a swift resolution. The legal system moved incredibly slowly. The case dragged on for months and months, stretching through the rest of the school year and through the entire summer. But finally, as the school year started up again and Missy entered her junior year, a court date was set. By October 1st, 1985, Missy was just 1 week away from finally going to court, taking the witness stand, and testifying against Sonia Ballen. Naturally, Missy was extremely nervous about this. She was a 17-year-old girl who was going to have to face her attacker in a court of law and recount the terrifying beating she had endured. But deep down, she knew she was doing the right thing. She wanted justice, and she wanted to make sure that nothing like this ever happened to anyone else. On October 1st, which was a Tuesday, Missy came home from school just like she did any other day. She dropped her school books off, sat down with her mother, Irene, and told her that she had plans that afternoon to go out and hang out with some of her friends. This was a very common, routine occurrence for Missy. She had a huge social circle, and she loved spending her free time socializing and being active. Her mother, Irene, did not see any issue with this. She just looked at Missy and told her that she could go, but she had to be back home by 6 o'clock sharp for dinner, Missy smiled, agreed to the curfew, and said she would be back on time. Just a few minutes later, a car pulled up on the street directly outside of Missy's house. Inside the car was 17-year-old Laura Doyle. Laura was one of Missy's very close friends, and she had driven over to pick Missy up so they could go hang out. Laura tapped on the horn to let Missy know she was there. Inside the house, Missy heard the honk, said a quick goodbye to her mother and her brother, ran out the front door, and walked down the pathway to the waiting car. She hopped into the passenger seat, closed the door, and the two girls drove away, chatting and laughing. Fast forward to 6 o'clock that evening. The sun was starting to set, and inside the Avila home, Irene was getting dinner ready. But as she looked at the clock, she noticed that Missy was not home yet. Now, Irene was not immediately plunged into a state of panic. While Missy was generally a very good kid who stayed out of major trouble, she was still a teenager. She loved being out with her friends, and from time to time, she would push the limits of her curfew. It was not uncommon for Missy to stay out past 6 and then walk through the door with a big smile, apologizing and asking for forgiveness. Or, sometimes, she would call her mother right around curfew time and ask if she could have just a little bit more time to hang out. So, when the phone inside the house started ringing shortly after 6 o'clock, Irene felt a wave of relief. She assumed it was Missy calling to apologize for being late or asking to stay out a bit longer. Irene walked over to the phone, picked up the receiver, and said hello. But the voice on the other end of the line was not Missy's. Instead, it was another young girl's voice, and it sounded incredibly strained and nervous. It was Laura Doyle, the girl who had picked Missy up earlier that afternoon. Before Irene could even ask Laura where Missy was, Laura spoke up in a very awkward, hesitant tone. She asked Irene if Missy was home yet. Irene was immediately confused by the question. She replied that Missy was not home, and then she said that she thought Missy was with her. After all, Laura had been the one to pick her up. Why would she be asking if Missy was home? As soon as Irene said this, Laura's tone shifted from awkward to sheer panic. She began to stammer, and then she proceeded to tell Irene a deeply concerning story about what had allegedly happened that afternoon. Laura claimed that after she picked Missy up from her house, the two of them had just driven around town for a while, listening to music and talking, which was a very normal thing for them to do. Eventually, they decided to drive over to Stonehurst Park, a local park where they and their friends frequently gathered to hang out. Laura said that she pulled her car into the Stonehurst Park parking lot and immediately started looking around to see if she could spot any vehicles belonging to people they knew. But as she scanned the parking lot, she did not recognize a single car. Figuring that none of their friends were there, Laura decided there was no point in staying, so she began to turn her car around to leave the park and head back into town. But as she was doing this, Missy suddenly grabbed her arm and told her to wait. Missy pointed out across the parking lot and said that she recognized some guys over there and she wanted to go over and say hello to them. Laura stopped her car and looked in the direction Missy was pointing. On the far side of the parking lot, standing next to a bright blue Chevrolet Camaro, were two guys who looked to be in their late teens or early 20s. Laura looked at them, but she did not recognize either of them. They were total strangers to her. Now, Laura explained to Irene that she was very used to Missy knowing absolutely everyone in town. Missy was so outgoing and popular that she seemed to have acquaintances everywhere they went. But Laura herself was not a very outgoing person, and she felt incredibly uncomfortable with the idea of going over and socializing with two older, strange guys she had never met before. But Missy was really eager to go say hello, and she begged Laura to let her go. So, according to Laura, she relented. She told Missy to go ahead and walk over to say hi, and said that she would find a parking spot, park the car, and then join her in a minute. Missy was thrilled. She hopped out of the passenger seat, closed the door, and began walking across the parking lot toward the blue Camaro, waving and smiling at the two guys who waved back at her. Meanwhile, Laura drove her car into a nearby parking stall. But just as she put the car in park and was preparing to turn off the engine, she happened to look down at her dashboard and noticed that her gas gauge was sitting well below empty. She realized she was practically running on fumes and might not even have enough gas to get home later. She rolled down her window and called out to Missy, who was about halfway across the parking lot by this point. Laura shouted that she needed to go run and get some gas right away, but that she would be right back to join them. Missy turned around, waved, and called back that it was fine, and told her she would see her when she got back. Laura said she put her car back in drive, pulled out of the parking space, and drove out of the Stonehurst Park lot, heading to a nearby gas station to fill up her tank. It only took her about 10 or 15 minutes to get the gas and drive back. But when Laura pulled her car back into the Stonehurst parking lot, she looked over toward the spot where the blue Camaro had been parked. The parking spot was completely empty. The blue Camaro, the two guys, and Missy were all gone. Laura sat in her car, staring at the empty space, feeling a mix of confusion and mild frustration. Since this was 1985, long before the era of cell phones, there was no way for Laura to call or text Missy to find out where she had gone. She couldn't ask if they had gone to get food or if the guys had offered her a ride somewhere else. Laura just sat there, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, she convinced herself that everything was probably fine. Missy knew those guys, and Missy was smart. She could take care of herself. Surely, those guys would just drive Missy back home when she was ready to go. Even though Laura tried to reassure herself, she still felt uneasy. She decided to drive around the local area for a while, scanning the streets and other parking lots, hoping to spot the distinctive blue Camaro or see Missy walking along the sidewalk. But after driving around for quite some time and finding absolutely no sign of her friend, Laura finally gave up and went back to her own house. She waited until just after 6 o'clock to call Missy's house, knowing that Missy had a strict 6 o'clock curfew and would definitely be home by then if she had been dropped off. But now, speaking to Irene on the phone, Laura realized with horror that Missy had not made it home. Hearing this story, Irene was instantly gripped by a deep, unsettling anxiety. It was completely unlike Missy to just vanish like this, especially with two older guys that her close friend did not even know. But at this point, neither Irene nor Laura felt that they should involve the police just yet. After all, it had only been a short while since her curfew, and they did not want to cause a massive, unnecessary scene if Missy was simply running late or had lost track of time. Instead, Irene and Laura decided to take matters into their own hands. Over the next several hours, they sat by their phones, calling every single friend, classmate, and acquaintance they could think of, asking if anyone had seen Missy or if they knew who the guys with the blue Camaro might be. But person after person answered with the exact same response. They had not seen Missy all day, and they had no idea who those guys were. When phone calls yielded absolutely no results, Irene and Laura met up in person. Despite the darkness and the late hour, they began going door to door, visiting the homes of Missy's friends, knocking on doors, and pleading with anyone who answered for any shred of information. They walked the streets, calling out Missy's name into the night. But as the hours ticked by and midnight came and went, they had found absolutely nothing. No one had seen her, and no one knew where she was. Exhausted, utterly terrified, and completely out of options, Laura and Irene finally decided that there was nothing more they could do that night. They went back to their respective homes, hoping against hope that Missy would walk through the front door in the morning or that the phone would ring with good news. But the next morning, Wednesday, October 2nd, came and went, and there was still no sign of Missy. Her bed had not been slept in, and there was no word from her. Irene knew in her gut that something terrible had happened. She could not wait any longer. That morning, she went straight to the local police department and reported her 17-year-old daughter missing. The police immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. A young girl, just a week away from testifying in a high-profile assault case, had vanished without a trace. They immediately zeroed in on Laura Doyle since she was the very last person known to have seen Missy alive. Detectives sat down with Laura and began grilling her, going over every single detail of her story. They pressed her for information about the blue Camaro. What year was it? Did it have any dents or custom features? What did the license plate look like? They asked her to describe the two guys in as much detail as possible. What were they wearing? How tall were they? What did their faces look like? Did Missy call them by their names? Laura was visibly distraught. She was crying, shaking, and completely consumed by guilt. She kept telling the detectives how incredibly sorry she was, sobbing that she never should have left Missy alone in that parking lot and that she should have just stayed instead of going to get gas. She tried her absolute best to answer all of their questions, but she explained that she had been quite far away from the guys and their car. She could only provide very basic, vague, physical descriptions. She said they looked like typical local teenagers or young adults, maybe with dark hair, but she couldn't give any specific facial features because she hadn't been paying close attention and was far away. Despite the lack of specific details, the police took the lead seriously. They launched a massive, coordinated search effort. Officers searched Stonehurst Park from top to bottom, looking for any tire tracks, dropped items, or witnesses who might have seen the blue Camaro. They set up checkpoints and began searching the surrounding neighborhoods of Arletta. At the same time, Missy's family, led by her devastated mother Irene, along with Laura and dozens of other volunteer friends and classmates, organized their own massive search parties. They printed out hundreds of flyers with Missy's picture on them and plastered them on utility poles, storefront windows, and car windshields all over the area. They walked through parks, searched vacant lots, and went down into local ravines, calling out Missy's name. But as Tuesday turned into Wednesday and Wednesday turned into Thursday, neither the official police search nor the desperate efforts of the volunteers turned up a single clue. There was no sign of Missy, no sign of the blue Camaro, and no one in the area recalled seeing two older guys fitting that description. It was as if Missy had simply evaporated into thin air. Then, on Friday, October 4th, just 3 days after Missy went missing, her body was found by those hikers in the Angeles National Forest. When the investigators arrived at the stream, they immediately secured the area and began a detailed search for any physical evidence. Just a short distance away from where Missy's body lay in the water, investigators found several discarded cigarette butts, an empty beer bottle, and a pair of men's denim overalls lying on the ground. In reality, these items had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. They had been left there days or even weeks before by random people who had visited the forest to hang out. But because of the incredibly detailed lie that Laura Doyle had told the police about the two older guys and the blue Camaro, these items seemed to perfectly fit her story. The detectives fell right into the trap. They assumed that the two mysterious guys from the park had taken Missy up into the mountains, hung out, smoked cigarettes, drank beer, and then for some unknown reason, murdered her. The police spent the next several months aggressively chasing down leads about blue Camaros in the San Fernando Valley, interviewing dozens of young men who owned similar cars, and trying to trace the origin of the overalls. But because the blue Camaro and the two guys were entirely fictional, the investigation went completely cold. For 3 long years, Missy's family lived in a state of agonizing limbo. They knew she was gone, but they had absolutely no idea who had killed her or why. The police had no solid suspects, and the trail had gone cold. But the absolute worst, most chilling part of this entire 3-year period is what one of Missy's childhood best friends, Karen Severson, did in the weeks and months immediately following the murder. Shortly after Missy's body was recovered and identified, Karen contacted Missy's grieving mother, Irene. Karen put on a masterful performance of pure, unadulterated grief. She fell to her knees, crying hysterically, and told Irene how completely devastated she was by the loss of her best friend. She claimed that she was too afraid and too sad to be alone in her own house, and she asked Irene if she could move into the Avila home. She said she wanted to help support the family during this unimaginably difficult time, and that being in Missy's house would help her feel close to her departed friend. Irene, who had known Karen since she was a little girl and viewed her almost as a second daughter, was deeply touched by this request. She welcomed Kinlist up to her home with open arms, thinking that having Missy's best friend around would help them grieve together and keep Missy's memory alive. For months, Karen Severson lived under the Avila roof. She slept in Missy's actual bed, surrounded by Missy's stuffed animals, her clothes, and her photos. She sat at the family dinner table every single night, eating the food that Irene lovingly prepared. She would sit next to Irene on the couch, comfortingly patting her hand as Irene wept over the loss of her daughter. Karen would even cry along with her, telling her how much she missed Missy and how unfair it was that someone had taken her life. But in reality, Karen's motivation for moving into the house was completely sinister and cold-blooded. She had not moved in out of grief or love. She had moved in to keep close tabs on the police investigation. She wanted to make sure she knew exactly what the detectives were doing, what clues they had, and if they were getting any closer to the truth. Whenever the police would visit the Avila home to give Irene an update on the case, Karen was always there. She would hover in the background, listening to every single detail the detectives shared. And whenever the conversation turned to potential suspects, Karen would actively manipulate the discussion to throw the police off her and Laura's trail. She would suggest other classmates at school, talk about how suspicious certain boys were, and constantly bring up the story of the blue Camaro, keeping the investigation thoroughly derailed. Karen even went so far as to spend hours in the car with Irene, driving around the streets of Arleta and the surrounding communities, pretending to search for any signs of the blue Camaro or the two mysterious guys. She watched Irene cry, she listened to her pour her heart out in absolute agony, and she offered her fake comfort, all while knowing that she was the very person who had held Missy's head under the water and ended her life. But while Karen seemed to have absolutely no conscience, the third girl who had been in the woods that day, 17-year-old Ava Sarambolo, was living in her own personal waking nightmare. For 3 long years, Eva carried the weight of the horrifying secret. She had not participated in the physical attack or the murder, but she had stood there and watched it happen, and she had done nothing to stop it. In the days immediately following the murder, Karen and Laura had cornered Eva. They looked her dead in the eye and delivered a chilling threat. If she ever spoke a single word to anyone, including her parents, her friends, or the police about what had happened in the woods, they would do the exact same thing to her. They told her that they would drag her up to the mountains, beat her, and drown her in the stream, just like they had done to Missy. Knowing what they were capable of, Eva believed them completely. She was absolutely terrified of Karen and Laura. She lived in constant, paralyzing fear that they would find out she had talked, or that they would decide to eliminate her anyway just to be safe. For 3 years, Eva's life fell apart. She couldn't sleep, her grades plummeted, she isolated herself from everyone, and she was constantly looking over her shoulder. Every time she closed eyes, she heard Missy's final, terrifying scream echoing through the trees. She saw the pain of Missy's family on the news, and the guilt began to eat her alive from the inside out. Finally, in 1988, the burden of the secret became too heavy for Eva to bear. She realized she couldn't live like this anymore. She decided that she had to face her fear, no matter the consequences. One afternoon, Eva walked into the local police station. She sat down with a detective, her hands shaking, and told them that she had information about the murder of Michelle Missy Avila. And then she proceeded to tell the detectives the entire shocking and detailed truth about what had actually happened on October 1st, 1985. The detectives listened in absolute stunned silence as Eva dismantled the 3-year-old mystery of the blue Camaro and the 2 older guys. She explained that the entire story was a complete fabrication and that Missy's two childhood best friends, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle, were the ones who had planned and executed her murder. The police acted immediately. They gathered their evidence, obtained arrest warrants, and went out to apprehend Karen and Laura. When the news of the arrests broke, Missy's family was completely shattered. Irene could not comprehend the sheer, unimaginable level of betrayal. The girl who had lived in her house, slept in her dead daughter's bed, eaten her food, and pretended to comfort her for months was actually her daughter's killer. It was a level of deception that seemed almost too evil to be real. During the high-profile trial that followed, the prosecution laid out the entire case using Eva's detailed eyewitness testimony to reconstruct the final hours of Missy's life. The defense tried to downplay their client's roles, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw the calculated nature of the rumors, the staged fight, and the brutal, prolonged method of the killing. Both Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were found guilty of second-degree murder. They were each sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Decades passed, and the girls who had committed such a heinous crime grew old behind bars. But eventually, the justice system deemed them fit for release. Karen Severson was granted parole and released from prison in December of 2011. Just a year later, in December of 2012, Laura Doyle was also paroled and walked free. Today, both women are out of prison, living their lives, while Missy Avila's life was permanently cut short at just 17 years old. The tragic story of Missy Avila remains one of the most chilling examples of jealousy, betrayal, and cold-blooded deception in the history of Southern California, leaving a lasting, painful, and deep emotional scar on her family, her loved ones, and the entire community of Arleta. But how did we get here? When Karen, Laura, and Missy were growing up, they were inseparable. They lived on the very same street in Arleta, California, which meant they spent virtually every waking hour of their childhood together, sharing jokes, playing in the street, and growing up side by side. They would walk to school side by side, share their lunch boxes, spend weekends at each other's houses, and talk for hours about their dreams for the future. They had built a deep, seemingly unbreakable bond that had survived the test of time through all the minor fights and disagreements that young kids typically have. But as they entered their teenage years and moved into high school, the dynamic between them began to change in a very subtle yet highly destructive way. Missy really blossomed during these teenage years. She grew into an exceptionally beautiful young woman with gorgeous dark hair, perfect skin, and a striking magnetic look that naturally drew people toward her. She was also incredibly popular at school, and she didn't have to try hard to make friends. People were just naturally drawn to her warmth, her gentle nature, and her easy laughter. But for Karen and Laura, the teenage years were much more difficult and painful. They both struggled deeply with their physical appearance and their social standing. Karen grew to be quite large, eventually weighing over 200 pounds, and she felt incredibly self-conscious and awkward in her own body. Laura also struggled with deep insecurities, feeling like she was plain, boring, and completely invisible whenever she stood next to her stunningly beautiful best friend. They began to notice that boys would only talk to them as a way to get closer to Missy. At parties, on the school bus, and in the hallways, Missy was always the center of attention, while Karen and Laura felt like they were nothing more than background props. Over time, as they watched Missy get all the attention, praise, and affection that they desperately craved for themselves, a dark, venomous jealousy began to fester deep inside of them. They started to resent Missy for simply being pretty and liked. And eventually, that resentment curdled into pure, unadulterated hatred. This hatred was what drove them to start that first, highly malicious rumor during their sophomore year in 1984. They were the ones who whispered to other classmates that Missy was sleeping with guys who had established girlfriends. They wanted to see her get hurt, to see her cry, and to see her perfect reputation dragged through the mud. And they got exactly what they wanted when Sonia Bond and her group of friends ambushed Missy outside of school and beat her up so badly. But as the months went on, they realized that the beating hadn't actually ruined Missy's life. If anything, it had made people love and protect her even more. Missy's family had pressed charges, and Missy was now viewed as a brave, strong girl who was going to stand up in court and testify against her bullies. This filled Karen and Laura with absolute rage. They felt like Missy hadn't suffered enough, and they began to discuss a much more permanent and horrific solution. They decided that they were going to end her life. Their murder plot was meticulously thought out over several weeks. They knew they couldn't just attack her out of the blue because the police would immediately suspect them given their close connection. They needed a plan that would isolate Missy and lure her to a secluded location without raising any suspicion. So, they decided to start a second rumor. This rumor claimed that Missy was sleeping with boyfriends who belonged to Karen and Laura. They did this very intentionally, knowing that it would start a massive, explosive fight between the three of them. They wanted to create a highly public rift in their friendship so that everyone would see them fighting. And indeed, the rumor worked exactly as they had planned. It led to the screaming match where Karen slapped Missy in the face. This slap was a calculated move to draw a clear line of division between them. But then, they put the next phase of their plan into motion. They knew that Missy was an incredibly forgiving, sweet person who hated conflict and loved her friends deeply. They knew she would be devastated by the thought of her childhood friends hating her, and that she would do anything to fix the relationship. So, after letting the silence drag on for a couple of weeks, Laura approached Missy and pretended to be remorseful. She told Missy that she had realized the rumor was a lie, and she wanted them to be friends again. Missy was overjoyed and immediately forgave her. Then, on the morning of October 1st, Karen contacted Missy to deliver her own tearful, fabricated apology. She told Missy that she was so sorry for slapping her and that she missed her terribly. She suggested that they all meet up that afternoon at Stonehurst Park, just like the old times, to put the past behind them once and for all. Missy, completely blind to the danger she was in, was thrilled at the prospect of her friends loving her again. She agreed to the meeting without a single second of hesitation, utterly unaware that she was walking directly into a deadly trap planned by those she trusted most. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In 2014, a young woman named Jen was relaxing in her sister's living room. She was watching her son and her two nephews playing outside in the backyard. It was a perfectly normal, quiet afternoon. As she watched them, one of her nephews, a little boy named Harrison, walked over to a big tree in the yard. He started peeling the bark off of it the way kids sometimes do, just mindlessly picking at it. For Jen, seeing this simple act triggered a strange and deeply buried childhood memory. It was something she hadn't thought about in decades. Without even meaning to, she just sort of blurted out what was on her mind. She said, "So weird." Her mother, who was in the next room, heard her. Her mom called out, "Jen, is everything okay?" "What's so weird?" Jen felt a little embarrassed. She hadn't meant for anyone to hear her talking to herself. She quickly tried to brush it off, saying, "Oh, no, sorry. It's nothing. I didn't mean to say that out loud, but it was too late." Her mom was curious now. She walked into the living room and saw Jen looking out the back window at the boys. Her mom came right up next to her and looked out too. She asked, "What are the boys doing out there? Are they getting into trouble?" Jen shook her head. No, it's not the kids. I just saw Harrison doing something that reminded me of a weird thing that happened to me when I was a kid. I just reacted to the memory, that's all." Jen's mom looked at her, totally intrigued now. She said, "Well, you can't just say that and not tell me." "What's the memory?" Jen sighed. she figured she might as well tell her. Okay, Mom, I'll tell you. I don't know if Frankie's mom ever told you this or not, but it was back when I was 8 years old. I had called my friend Frankie, and he was busy with some homework. He told me to come over and meet him outside his house, and we could go play when he was done. She continued, painting the picture for her mom. So I walked over to his house. I was standing across the street from his place, in front of that little group of trees we used to call the Pinecone Forest. It wasn't really a forest, just a handful of trees, but that's what we called it. Anyway, I was standing there waiting, and I started peeling the bark off one of the trees. I don't even think I realized I was doing it. I was just passing the time. As Jen was talking, the memory became clearer and clearer in her mind. So I'm peeling the bark, watching Frankie's house for him to come out. And then I noticed a guy to my right, walking through the trees, coming towards me. I'd never seen him before in our neighborhood. Even before he got close, I could smell him. He just reeked of stale cigarettes. His teeth were very yellow, and he was missing a few of them. And I remember looking at his hands. I don't know why, but I did. He had these long, pointy, yellow fingernails. They looked like he was growing them out on purpose, all jagged and sharp. He walked right up to me and stopped. Way too close, totally in my personal space. But he didn't look at me at first. He looked at the spot on the tree where I had been peeling the bark off. He was maybe a foot away from me. I remember having to lean back because I didn't want to be rude and just run away. All I could smell was that awful cigarette smoke. Then he turned from the tree and looked right at me. He said, "What do you think you're doing?" I was so startled, I just said, "I'm waiting for my friend." He shook his head. "No." "What are you doing to the tree?" I looked at him, then back at the tree and said, "Peeling the bark off." And that's when he reached out and pinched my arm. He didn't use the pads of his fingers. He used those long nails. He dug them into my skin, and through his gritted yellow teeth, he whispered, "How would you like it if someone peeled your skin off?" Jen paused for a moment, remembering the feeling. I was so terrified, I just froze. I was like I was in a trance. I just stood there looking at him, wondering what was going to happen next. Then, just by pure luck, Frankie's mom came out onto their porch and yelled, "Hey, come on inside." Frankie's done with his homework now. That broke the spell. I pulled my arm away and just started running across the street to Frankie's house. I looked back once, expecting him to be chasing me, but he wasn't. He was still standing there by the tree, just watching me. I ran inside, and that was it. I remember wanting to tell you about it when I got home, but for some reason, I just didn't. Then days turned into weeks, and eventually, I guess I just forgot about it. Until just now, when I saw Harrison peeling the bark off that tree, it all came rushing back. That's why I said so weird. I was just wondering who that guy was. Coden. After Jen finished her story, she expected her mom to be horrified, but also to move on pretty quickly. After all, this was an old story from 2 decades ago, and nothing bad had ultimately happened to her. But her mom's reaction was not what she expected. Her mom looked deeply concerned, almost haunted. Jen tried to downplay it. "Mom, this was forever ago." I was 8. It's not a big deal. Her mom looked down at the floor for a second, then looked back up at Jen. There was a look of pure guilt on her face. She said, "Jen, I should have told you this when it happened. But you were so young. I felt like it would ruin your childhood, so I didn't. It seemed like you forgot all about it, so I let it be. But obviously, you didn't forget. I guess you need to hear the whole story now." Jen was completely confused. "What are you talking about?" "What whole story?" Her mother looked incredibly uncomfortable now. She was wringing her hands, touching her face, just radiating anxiety. She told Jen, "It's time you learned who that man really was." Before Jen could even ask another question, her mom just said, "Honey, please just sit down. I'll explain everything." They both sat down on the couch. Jen's mom took a deep breath, clearly struggling to start. "Okay," she began. "So do you remember how our old neighborhood was? How everyone knew everyone? It was such a tight-knit community." Jen nodded. "Yeah, I remember." Her mom continued, "Well, because of that, it was really easy to spot an outsider. If a car I didn't recognize came down our street, I'd find myself looking out the window, watching to see where it was going. There was no reason to be in that neighborhood unless you lived there or were visiting someone. I was always people watching, and I know a bunch of the other moms did the same thing. One of them was Frankie's mom, Sonia. Well, on the exact same day that man approached you in 1995, that morning, Sonia happened to look out her front window. She saw a vehicle she didn't recognize. It was a white work van, the kind with no windows in the back. It was parked across the street, right near the pinecone forest. Sonia figured it was a work truck and that whoever was driving it was probably working on one of the houses. But the spot where it was parked was strange. It wasn't close to any one particular house. There were plenty of other spots to park on the street that would have been more convenient. It seemed odd to park so far away in front of that random patch of trees. That's what made her suspicious. She didn't think anything terrible was happening, she just couldn't make sense of it. So all morning, she kept going back to the window, looking out, waiting to see if anyone would go to the van, but she never saw a soul. No workers going in or out, no activity at all. It was just this empty, silent van parked across the street. By the afternoon, when still no one had claimed it, she was getting ready to call the police. Jen's mom then connected the two stories. That was the same day you and Frankie had talked on the phone. You made plans to meet up near the pinecone forest after his homework. He never told his mom about those plans. If he had, she would have told you to come straight inside and stay away from that van. But she didn't know you were going to be out there. So, sometime in the afternoon, while Sonia is about to call the police, you were already over there by the trees waiting for Frankie. Sonia looked out the window one more time, and that's when she saw it. The back two doors of the van flew open, and that man who pinched you jumped out. He started running straight into the pinecone forest. From where Sonia was standing at her front window, she could only see part of the forest. The other part, where you were, was out of her view to the right. So she turned and ran to a side window in her house. She looked out that window and saw the rest of the forest. And there you were. You were standing in front of the tree, and she saw this man sprint right up to you. She saw him pinch your arm and lean in to talk to you. That's when she ran out onto her porch and yelled for you to come inside. She told me later that she tried to sound as natural and calm as she could. She was worried that if she sounded panicked, it would not only scare you, but it might trigger the stranger to do something drastic, like grab you. She knew he'd been made. So she watched him the whole time you were running to the house to make sure he didn't chase you. As soon as you were safely inside, she told you to go play with Frankie. The moment you were out of the room, she ran around her house and locked every single door and every single window. Then she called me. We both decided we had to call the police. Even though you were safe, we had no idea who this guy was. And the way he came out of that van, it seemed like he was intentionally waiting for you. So Sonia called the police. A cruiser was sent over to the neighborhood right away. The officers found the white van exactly where she said it would be. They pulled up next to it and walked to the driver's side. And sitting inside was a man who matched the description Sonia gave them perfectly. He was acting really weird. He looked like he was on drugs or maybe drunk. Something was definitely off about him. The officers had him step out of the vehicle. They searched the front seats, but there was nothing there besides cigarette butts and old trash. There was a partition wall separating the front seats from the back of the van. They walked around to the back. And they saw that this guy had screwed a heavy-duty latch across the middle of the two back doors. There was a big padlock through it. It was an extra lock, clearly meant to keep people from getting in or maybe from getting out. The police turned to the guy and said they needed to get in the back of his van. They asked him to open it. At first, he made a bunch of excuses, saying he couldn't. But eventually, he gave in. He pulled out a keychain he was carrying. It had 2 distinct keys on it. He used one of them to undo the padlock. He swung the doors open and stepped back. The police shined their flashlights inside. And they couldn't believe what they were looking at. Jen's mom's voice trembled slightly as she described it. Inside that van, on every single surface in the back, were pictures of you. They were taped to the walls, to the floor, to the ceiling. Everywhere they looked, it was your face. And they weren't just recent pictures. There were at least a couple of you when you were only 6 years old. You were 8 when he approached you. So he had been following you, watching you, for at least 2 years. Also, in the back of the van were a pair of binoculars and a camera, which they assumed he was using to take the photos. But that wasn't even the worst part of it. After they arrested him, one of the officers looked closer at that keychain, the one with the key to the padlock. He noticed the other key wasn't a duplicate. It was a different, unique key. So the police went over to the guy and they showed him the key. They asked him, "What is this for?" And he told them it was for his storage locker. The police tracked down the storage facility and they went there. They used the key on the lock of his unit. It worked. They slid open the heavy metal door, and what was inside was something straight out of a nightmare. The entire storage locker, from the ceiling to the floor to all 4 walls, was completely covered in clear plastic wrap. It was all sealed up. And behind the plastic on the walls, they could see hundreds more pictures of you. In the very middle of the storage locker was a dentist's chair. It had been bolted and anchored into the concrete floor. Next to the dentist's chair was a small silver tray, the kind you see at a dentist's office. But on the tray, there weren't dental tools. There were knives, not surgical knives. They were meat cleavers and large hunting knives, crude, heavy instruments. Next to that, on a small table, was an anatomy book. He had used printouts of your face to bookmark different pages and sections of the book. He had been taking notes and highlighting passages, all of them having to do with female anatomy. In the back of the locker, there was a rotted mattress just sitting on the ground. And anchored into the back wall were heavy chains with handcuffs dangling from them. And next to the mattress were dozens of empty 5-gallon drums. When the police showed us the pictures of the inside of his van, we were so shaken up. It was awful to imagine someone watching you like that. But when they showed us the pictures of that chamber he had built inside of his storage locker, that's something I will just never get over. He clearly had a plan for you, Jen. A terrible plan. After hearing this story from her mother, Jen was a whirlwind of emotions. She was angry with her mom for keeping such a monumental secret from her for all those years. But she was also incredibly sad. Sad for her mom, who had to carry the weight of that horror, knowing what had almost happened to her child. Now that Jen was a mother herself, she could only imagine how horrible that must have been. So, the only thing she could think to do was to give her mom a hug. After they embraced, Jen pulled back and asked the question that was burning in her mind. What happened to him? Where is he now? Did he go to jail? Her mom told her that the man had confessed to stalking her. He admitted that everything in the van and the storage locker was his, and he seemed to understand the implications of what they found. But he never gave his real motives. He never explained what his actual intentions were. He was ultimately deemed criminally insane and was put into a high-security mental institution. Her mom said she had no idea if he was still alive or where he was today. That was the last she had ever heard about him. And so, Jen decided to do some of her own homework. She managed to figure out where the man was being held. She requested a meeting with him. She wanted to ask him face to face what he had been planning to do to her. She needed to know why. And to her surprise, he agreed to meet with her. The meeting was scheduled. But the day before it was supposed to happen, he took his own life. Jen never found out if his decision was a direct result of their impending meeting, but it certainly seemed likely. And unfortunately, that's where the story ends. She never got any more answers. It will forever end with a big, haunting question mark. What was he going to do to her, and why? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya!
Sometimes the world presents us with a story so strange, so perfectly bizarre, that it feels like it must have a supernatural explanation. A voice from beyond the grave, a town-wide curse, a ghost reaching through a wall. These are the kinds of tales that make the hair on your arms stand up. But often, when you peel back the layers of the impossible, you don't find a ghost. You find something far more terrifying. A human being. Today we have 3 stories that all start in that strange, mysterious place, but end with a truth that is all too real and all too dark. Late on the night of the 26th of October 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was resting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio. The house was quiet, and she was just enjoying the peace before heading to bed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp ring of the telephone. The first thing Ethel did was glance at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands pointed to 10:30. That was unusual. Very few people, if any, ever called her this late at night. A knot of worry tightened in her stomach. A call at this hour usually meant bad news. She slowly got to her feet, walked over to the phone, and picked up the receiver. She said, "Hello?" On the other end of the line, a man's voice said back, "Hey sis." Ethel instantly recognized the voice. It wasn't one of her brothers, despite the familiar greeting. It was someone who was practically family, her husband Don's very best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. For decades, Lee had been their next-door neighbor. He and Don and Ethel were inseparable. They were at each other's houses almost every single day, sharing meals, helping with chores, just living life together. They were the kind of friends who become an extension of your own family. A few years back, Lee had moved to a different town, so they didn't see each other quite as often, but the bond was still just as strong. They still got together whenever they could, and Lee made a point to call regularly just to check in and see how they were doing. So, hearing Lee's voice wasn't a surprise. But the time of the call was still a bit odd. Ethel figured he was just calling for a late-night chat. But before she could even reply to his greeting, before she could ask why he was calling so late, Lee just kept talking. It was strange. It was like he wasn't having a conversation with her, but was just delivering a message he had to get out. He spoke in a flat, hurried tone. He said, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like I've never felt this way before. I really need your husband, Don, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then, just like that, the line went dead. He had hung up. Ethel stood there holding the silent receiver, completely bewildered. The whole call had lasted maybe 10 seconds. On one hand, it seemed like he was just checking in, but the words he used were serious, alarming. "I've never felt this way before. That's not something you say lightly." But there was something else, something that made a chill run down her spine. How did Lee know that Dawn wasn't home? Her husband was out for the evening and wasn't due back for a little while. Lee had stated it as a fact, the moment he gets back. It was as if he was standing outside their window watching the house. But that was impossible. He lived in another town. It just didn't make any sense. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Ethel tried to call him back immediately. The phone just rang and rang. No answer? She tried again a few minutes later, and then again. Still nothing. By the time her husband, Don, finally walked through the front door a little while later, Ethel was pacing with worry. She immediately told him about the strange call from Lee. She recounted the conversation word for word. She told him, he said he wasn't feeling good, that he needed you to call him as soon as you got back. But Dawn, the weirdest part was how he knew you were out. Dawn was just as confused as she was. He said, all right, that's weird. He took the phone from Ethel and dialed Lee's number himself. Again, it just rang unanswered. Now, Dawn was getting seriously concerned. He turned to Ethel and said, go over it again. What was his tone like? Did he sound like he was in pain? Was he scared? What exactly did he say? Ethel tried her best to describe it. She said, I don't know, he just sounded distant. He just stated that he didn't feel good and had never felt this way before. And he was very specific that you needed to call him when you came back. I just don't understand it. They both stood there in the quiet house, a shared feeling of dread hanging in the air. They knew Lee well enough to know he wasn't one for drama. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. After a few more failed attempts to reach him, they decided they couldn't just sit there and wait. They had to do something. They decided to just drive to his house in the next town and check on him in person just to make sure he was okay. So they locked up their house, got in their car, and started the drive into the dark night. When they finally arrived at Lee's house, all the lights were off. The place was dark and still. His car wasn't in the driveway. A quick look through the windows confirmed he wasn't there. Now, their worry was turning into real fear. Even though it was late, they started knocking on the doors of his neighbors, hoping someone had seen him or knew where he might be. After a few doors with no luck, one neighbor finally gave them a piece of information. The neighbor said they had seen an ambulance at Lee's house earlier in the evening and believed he had been taken to the hospital. For Ethel and Dawn, this was confirmation of their worst fears. Something was seriously wrong with their friend. They thanked the neighbor and rushed back to their car, heading straight for the nearest hospital, a place called Mercy Hospital. When they arrived, they hurried into the emergency room and spoke to the front desk. They explained that they were looking for their friend, Lee Epps. The nurse checked her records and confirmed that yes, Lee had been admitted earlier that night. But then her expression shifted, and her voice softened. She told them that, unfortunately, Lee had passed away. The news was a devastating blow. They had been friends for most of their lives. The thought of him being gone so suddenly and unexpectedly was almost impossible to process. But the most shocking part of their discovery was yet to come. As they spoke with the medical staff trying to understand what had happened to him, Dawn asked a simple question. He asked what time Lee had passed away. A doctor looked at the chart and then looked back at them. He told Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 that night. The exact moment, the exact minute. His official time of death was the very same moment that the phone had rung in Ethel's living room. The same moment she had heard her friend's voice on the other end of the line, saying he had never felt this way before and that he needed to speak to his best friend one last time. Ethel and Dawn had no way to prove it, of course. It was just their word against the laws of physics. But for the rest of their lives, they firmly believed that the phone call they received that night wasn't from a telephone line. It was from somewhere else. It was Lee's spirit reaching across the veil to say goodbye. But a mysterious phone call is one thing. What was happening in a small village in rural China was something else entirely. It was a tragedy on a scale that was almost unimaginable. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma King Mao and several of his family members walked through the streets of their home, Luowan village. Luowan was, or at least it had been, a beautiful and historic place. As they walked, they passed lush green fields and could see majestic mountains rising in the distance. But the scenery was scarred. Interspersed with the beauty were the charred, skeletal remains of dozens of buildings. It was a constant, painful reminder of what their community had lost. Ma King Mao had lived in this village his entire life. He remembered a time when it was a happy, vibrant, tight-knit community of over 100 people. It was a truly picturesque place to live, a place where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. But 3 years prior, everything had changed. Life in Luoan village had become a living nightmare, one disaster piling on top of another. It started with the fires. There hadn't been just one, but two enormous fires that had ripped through the village. The official cause was faulty wiring. These fires had destroyed homes, businesses, and priceless historic buildings. They had fundamentally changed the face of the town, and years later, the scars still hadn't healed. But as devastating as the fires were, it was what happened after the embers cooled that truly turned the village into a place of fear. For some unexplainable reason, the mortality rate in their small village suddenly skyrocketed. It seemed like every week someone else was just dropping dead. Healthy people, young people, it didn't matter. They would get sick suddenly and then pass away. The villagers became terrified. They started to believe that some kind of invisible plague had descended upon them, a curse they couldn't see or understand. The situation got so bad, with so many people dying, that China's Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, sent a team to conduct a full-blown investigation. They spent weeks in the village, testing, interviewing, and analyzing, but their conclusion was baffling. They announced that there was no connection between the deaths. They determined that everyone who had died had passed away from common illnesses or old age. They were all, according to the experts, natural deaths. It was just a tragic, statistical anomaly, an unfortunate spike in the mortality rate that just happened to follow the horrible fires. It was, they said, just a string of terrible coincidences. But many of the villagers, including Ma Qingmao, simply didn't buy it. It felt wrong. It felt like something more was at play. They started to whisper that their village wasn't unlucky. It was cursed. And so, on this summer afternoon, Ma Qingmao and his family walked past the burned-out shells of their old lives, making their way to the village temple. They were there for yet another funeral. This time, it was for a young woman from the village who had died just as inexplicably as all the others. According to the CDC, her death was from natural causes. But to the people who knew her, it made no sense at all. They filed into the temple, another cloud of grief hanging over their cursed home. Later that same night, Ma Qingmao stumbled through the dark, quiet streets, heading back to his house. After the funeral, he and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for a ceremonial dinner, which was a local custom. His family had left right after the meal, but Ma Qingmao, feeling particularly down about the state of his village, had stayed behind. He continued to eat and drink some alcohol, sharing stories and sorrows with his neighbors. Now, he was finally making his way home. But as he walked, a sudden, sharp pain shot through his stomach. It was so intense it nearly buckled his knees, making it incredibly difficult to walk. He clutched his abdomen, forcing himself to put one foot in front of the other, his house seeming miles away. When he finally reached his front door, he fumbled with the latch and stumbled inside. The pain was so blinding, so all-consuming, that he could only scream out for help before collapsing onto the floor right in front of his horrified family. As he lay on the ground, he began to vomit uncontrollably. And then, just moments later, he passed away. His family could do nothing but watch in horror. Now, Ma Qingmao wasn't a village leader or a person of great influence. He was just a man who had lived there his whole life, a man everyone knew and respected. But for some reason, his death felt different. It felt monumental. For the people of Luoan village, it was the absolute final straw. When they heard the news, a collective feeling washed over the community. Enough is enough. There was no possible way that all these deaths were natural. They refused to accept that answer any longer. The village director, who was essentially the town's mayor, got on the phone with the provincial health department. He explained the entire situation, the fires, the string of deaths, the CDC's inconclusive findings, and the village's refusal to believe them. The health department agreed to look into it and sent a team of 20 experts to the village. They conducted another massive investigation, trying to find any link, anything that could explain what was happening. And after all their work, they came back with the exact same conclusion as the CDC. It was all natural. There was nothing to worry about. But the villagers were not worrying. They were terrified and angry. They went back to their director and demanded that he do something else. This was not an acceptable answer. And he agreed. He made one last call, this time to the local police. He asked them to come in and conduct their own investigation, to look at this not as a health crisis, but as a potential crime. He begged them to see if there was anything, any small detail that the scientists might have missed. And so, the police came to Luoan village. They didn't bring microscopes or testing kits. They brought a different perspective. They started a broad, sweeping investigation, and very quickly they found something. Something the health experts had completely overlooked. And what they discovered explained everything. It turned out the village had one doctor, a man named Ma Fuxing. But Ma was not a real doctor. His medical training consisted of reading a couple of medical books. That was it. He had no formal education, no license, no real idea of what he was doing. And yet, he was the only person the villagers could turn to when they had any medical issues. He directly benefited every time someone got sick because they would come to him and pay for his useless treatments. So you had a man, posing as a doctor, who likely made his patients even sicker, and he was profiting from their illness. That was bad enough. But it got so much worse. Ma Fuxing was also the owner of the village's only funeral home. So, if his fake medicine didn't work and you died, he profited from you again. Ma Fuxing had a complete monopoly on sickness and death in Luoan village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money was if you stayed healthy. For a while, Ma Fuxing was content to just let this system play out. He was a fake doctor and a funeral director, and business was steady enough. But eventually, he got greedy. He wanted more money. So he started secretly poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide. Suddenly, more people started getting sick. And more people started dying. And for every single one of them, Ma Fuxing collected a fee. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted more. And so he looked around the village and decided to create even more death and suffering. Those two massive fires, the ones that were officially ruled as being caused by faulty wiring, that wasn't faulty wiring. That was arson. Ma Fuxing had set the fires himself, burning people's homes and businesses to the ground, killing people in the process, all because he knew he had a monopoly on the aftermath. Every death was just more business for him. The police investigation unraveled his entire scheme. They re-examined the fire scenes and quickly determined it was arson. From there, they started asking the one question the health experts never did: who benefits? All roads led back to Ma Fuxing. In the end, they determined he was responsible for the deaths of 76 people. These were his neighbors, people he had known his entire life. His friends. He had systematically murdered 76 of them for profit. He was ultimately arrested, convicted of murder and arson, and sentenced to death. The curse on Luoan village wasn't supernatural. It was a man. It's hard to imagine a more evil person. But sometimes evil isn't a stranger poisoning a town from the shadows. Sometimes it's sleeping in the room right next to yours. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh was sitting at a large dining room table inside his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father for a family visit. They were staying with his aunt, a woman named Miss Blackwood, and also visiting with his 19-year-old cousin, a young woman named Ballen. Ballen was Miss Blackwood's ward. Her own parents had died 4 years earlier, leaving her an orphan, and the very wealthy Miss Blackwood had graciously taken her in. She had become Ballen's de facto mother. On this particular morning, Paul, his parents, and Ballen were all gathered for a luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared. They were chatting and enjoying the food, but they were all waiting for one person to join them, Miss Blackwood herself. And this wasn't just a formality out of respect for their host. They genuinely adored her. Paul's aunt was a wonderful woman, full of energy and life. She was fun, she was witty, and yes, she was very wealthy, and her house was magnificent. Family visits with Miss Blackwood were always something to look forward to. Her arrival downstairs was what would truly start the day. But as time stretched on, and Miss Blackwood still hadn't appeared, the family began to eat. They figured she was just sleeping in or taking her time getting ready, and they would see her soon enough. So they ate their food and made pleasant conversation, enjoying the nice morning. Suddenly, their peaceful breakfast was shattered. The housemaid, who had gone upstairs a few minutes earlier, came running back into the dining room. Her face was pale with panic, and she was clearly distraught. She cried out that Miss Blackwood was dead. For a moment, Paul was just completely confused. It didn't make any sense. Just the night before, his aunt had been her usual vibrant self. She had seemed perfectly normal, perfectly healthy. There was absolutely no sign that anything was wrong with her. But the family immediately rushed out of the dining room and followed the frantic housemaid up the grand staircase to Miss Blackwood's bedroom. They pushed open the door, and there she was. Paul's aunt was lying in her bed, still and silent. She was cold to the touch. She was gone. Later that morning, Paul and his heartbroken family sat in the living room with Miss Blackwood's regular family doctor. He had just come from examining her body upstairs. He sat down with them and explained that while there were no clear signs of illness or injury, Miss Blackwood was 70 years old and had been diagnosed with heart disease a few years prior. In his professional opinion, her heart had simply given out in her sleep. It was a peaceful end. For the most part, the family reacted with a mixture of profound sadness and reluctant acceptance. It was tragic, but it made sense. Paul felt the same way, logically. It was awful, he couldn't believe she was gone, but the doctor's explanation seemed plausible. And yet, underneath the logic, there was a strange, nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, he couldn't articulate why, but he had an immediate gut-wrenching sense that this was not the whole story. He felt that something else had happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything. He kept his suspicions to himself. It felt inappropriate to start suggesting conspiracy theories just hours after his aunt had died, especially when there was a perfectly logical explanation right in front of them. So, he stayed quiet, but the feeling didn't go away. It just sat there in the pit of his stomach. After the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all stay at Miss Blackwood's house for the time being. There was so much to do. They had a funeral to plan, and they had to begin the complicated process of dealing with her will and her large estate. Since they had already planned to be there for a visit anyway, they decided to stay and help manage everything during this difficult transition. 5 weeks passed. Paul and his family were still living in Miss Blackwood's house. Sorting out her estate was proving to be a massive and complicated task, and it was taking much longer than anyone had anticipated. By this point, Paul's role in the legal and financial matters was minimal. He was mostly just there to provide emotional support for his parents as they navigated the complex paperwork. But secretly, Paul had taken on a mission of his own. He still hadn't told anyone about his persistent feeling that his aunt had been killed. He knew how crazy it sounded, especially since he had absolutely no evidence to support it other than that powerful gut feeling. But he hadn't been able to let it go. He had started his own quiet, secret investigation. His investigation had led him to a strange decision. He had started sleeping in his late aunt's bedroom. He had developed a belief that if he slept in her bed, in her room, then maybe her ghost would visit him. Maybe she would give him a sign, a clue, some kind of message that would tell him what really happened to her. For weeks, he had slept there every night, waiting. But he had seen nothing. No ghosts, no signs. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. On this particular night, 5 weeks to the day after his aunt's death, Paul was lying in her bed, getting ready to fall asleep. As he lay there in the darkness, he heard a strange sound coming from the side of the room. It was a faint, scraping noise, almost like scratching. The room was very dark, with only a little bit of moonlight filtering through the window. He opened his eyes and rolled over, peering into the shadows in the direction of the sound. At first, he couldn't see anything. But, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a hand. A disembodied hand connected to an arm was reaching out from the wall, stretching into the room in his direction. Now, Paul had obviously never seen anything like this before. Logically, he should have been terrified. He was, for all intents and purposes, seeing a ghost. But he wasn't scared. A strange sense of calm and validation washed over him. He thought, this is it. It's working. My aunt is here. She's going to tell me what happened. This was the sign he had been waiting for. With absolutely no fear, Paul got out of the bed. He walked silently across the room towards the disembodied arm that was protruding from the wall. And then he reached out and grabbed it. The moment his hand closed around the arm, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. It wasn't a ghostly wail, it was the very real shriek of a terrified person. The sound woke everyone up. Paul's father came running down the hall and burst into the bedroom. The sight that greeted him was baffling. He saw his son, Paul, standing in the middle of the room, holding on to an arm that was sticking out of a hole in the wall. It turned out there really was an arm reaching through the wall, but it wasn't a ghost. It belonged to a person who had everything to do with Miss Blackwood's death, because she did not die of heart disease. She was murdered. The person sleeping in the room next door had drilled a hole through the wall, a hole just big enough for an arm to pass through. And late at night, while Miss Blackwood was asleep, that person had reached through the hole and poured poison into the glass of water she always kept by her bedside. She had died in her sleep from the poison, and it had been mistaken for a heart attack. The killer was aware that Paul was suspicious. Even though Paul had kept his thoughts to himself, his actions, especially his insistence on sleeping in Miss Blackwood's room, had made the killer very nervous. It seemed like Paul was getting close to the truth. And so, the killer decided to get rid of him the same way they had gotten rid of his aunt. They waited for Paul to be asleep, saw the glass of water next to his bed, and reached through the hole to pour poison into it. But they hadn't counted on Paul being awake, waiting for a ghost. He heard the sound, saw the arm, and grabbed it, thinking he was making contact with the spirit world. In reality, he was catching his own would-be killer in the act. The screams were the sound of the killer, realizing they had been caught. And the killer was Paul's own 19-year-old cousin, Malene. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood had taken Malene in and treated her like her own daughter. She had even added Malene to her will, ensuring the girl would inherit a significant portion of her vast fortune. But Malene couldn't wait for her aunt to die of natural causes. She wanted the money now. And so she had murdered the woman who had saved her. Caught red-handed, Malene quickly confessed everything to Paul and his parents. They sent for the police to come and arrest her for the murder of Miss Blackwood and the attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could arrive, Malene suddenly began bleeding from her mouth. She collapsed onto the floor and died just minutes later. While it was never officially confirmed, it's widely believed that she used the very same poison she had used on her aunt to take her own life, choosing to die rather than face justice for her crimes. Every story tonight started with something that seemed supernatural. But in the end, the real horror wasn't a curse or a ghost. It was human greed. Because sometimes the darkest thing in this world isn't what hides in the shadows. It's what people are willing to do for money, power, or just a little bit more. Until next time.